Cobb waited another week. In Augusta, he received Connie Mack, who made the long trip down from Philadelphia, determined to get him into an athletics uniform. After 8 straight cellar finishes and 10 years out of the first division, the 64-year-old manager and part owner at Philadelphia had built another strong club. His athletics, featuring outstanding young players like catcher Gordon Mickey Cochran, outfielder Al Simmons, pitcher Bob Lefty Grove, and a muscular 19-year-old named Jimmy Fox, for whom Mack had not yet found a regular place, had finished second and third the last 2 years. The crowds had started coming back to Shibe Park, but the Philadelphia management suffered from not having Sunday home dates, a handicap that cost the club at least $250,000 a year. Mack knew Cobb's presence would mean bigger gate receipts for the Athletics, both at home and away. He also hoped the Georgian might be able to help his ball club. Mack offered Cobb either a $40,000 salary, a $25,000 bonus for signing, and another bonus of $10,000 to be paid at the end of the season, as newsmen close to the deal understood it, $70,000 in salary, and bonus plus 10% of all exhibition game receipts, as Cobb remembered it, or a salary of $80,000 plus a $20,000 bonus if Philadelphia won the World Series, according to Mack's recollection. Whatever the specifics of the arrangement, it came out to a lot of money, enough to make Cobb again the best-paid player in baseball. Yet Cobb needed a big baseball salary, even less in 1927, than he had when he took the Detroit manager's job 6 years earlier. It would be a matter of pride to come back as the highest-paid player, but Cobb was already rich, and destined to get much richer. He signed with Mack because he wanted to play on a winning ball club, because he had come to revere the Athletics leader, and most of all, because once more he had something to prove. The integrity of the Cobb name again had been called into question. Coming back in 1927, as he later wrote Mack, was a matter of necessity, of my vindication to the public. 11. Vindication. After spending the night and most of the next day in hiding in New York to avoid being hounded by reporters, Cobb took a train to Philadelphia late in the afternoon of February 8th. That evening, Mack, tall, thin, finely erect, dignified, introduced Cobb at the annual dinner of the Philadelphia chapter of the Baseball Writers Association. There, Cobb officially announced that he would play for the Athletics in 1927. It would be a great pleasure, he told the 700 people in the Hotel Adelphi banquet room, to play for Mr. Mack and with Eddie Collins. He only wished he'd come to Philadelphia a few years earlier, when I probably had more spring in my legs. Interrupted by shouts of, "You still have enough left," he went on to promise that there will not be a day, not an hour, nor a minute next summer, that I won't be giving the best that's in me. Beaming through the raucous standing ovation that followed, Cobb pondered the strange twist of his life. I'd battled and feuded with the A's and their fans most of my career, needed police protection at Shibe Park, and received a good dozen anonymous death threats there. The next afternoon, Cobb signed his contract at Mack's Shibe Park office and got measured for his first big league uniform that would not have a D on the shirt front. Since the end of the season, newsmen estimated, Mack had spent something like $250,000 to strengthen his team. Besides Collins and Cobb, 38-year-old Zach Wheat, an outfield star for 18 years with Brooklyn in the National League, had also come to the Athletics. Moreover, Mack had paid Jack Dunn at Baltimore a handsome sum for shortstop Joe Boley, who now rejoined lefty Grove and second baseman Max Bishop, Boley's teammates on what had been one of the greatest minor league outfits ever. Cobb left town, promising that he'd be at the Athletics spring training camp at Fort Myers, Florida, when it opened on March 1st. Experienced baseball people knew better than to take Cobb at his word when it came to spring reporting dates. With Charlie and son Herschel, now 10, he made a leisurely trip down from Augusta in his $6,000 Chrysler, stopping off at Sarasota to spend a few days with his brother Paul, now a successful realtor, and his mother and sister Florence, who a few years earlier had also moved there. Cobb went on alone to Fort Myers, the southernmost of the major league training sites, and arrived on Sunday night, March 6th. The next day, he weighed in at 192.5 pounds, got into uniform, and went out to oblige a dozen photographers and newsreel cameramen by posing with just about everybody, including the octogenarian Thomas A. Edison. For the moving picture crews, Cobb tossed a ball underhand to the famed inventor from about 8 feet, and almost had his sparse hair parted by Edison's sharp line drive. On March 9th, Cobb appeared in his first game as a Philadelphia Athletic. Charlie and Roswell Herschel Cobb, Amanda and Florence Cobb, and Paul Cobb, his wife, and Paul Jr., all came down the 60 or so miles from Sarasota to see him in action against the Giants. Cobb played right field, doubled his first time up off Virgil Cheeves, later made a nice catch going back on Bill Terry's drive, and retired after 6 innings. When Mac, who had wondered how Cobb would respond to instructions, waved his famous scorecard to position his outfielders, Cobb saluted me as a soldier salutes a general, and followed orders. Cobb felt so good physically, and about things in general, that he was already talking about maybe playing another year beyond this one. "You'll see a new Ty Cobb on the ball field this summer," he told St. Louis sports writer Sid Keener. An incident occurred 8 days later at St. Petersburg that was all too reminiscent of the old Cobb. The Athletics were ahead of the Boston Braves 5-0 in the top of the 4th, with Eddie Collins at bat and Cobb on deck. The plate umpire was Frank Wilson, who had worked his way back up to the National League staff after being fired by Ban Johnson a few years earlier. Cobb's frequent adversary in the past, Wilson now suddenly whirled and yelled, "Get out of the park, Cobb! Get out of the park!" As Cobb came forward, protesting that he had said nothing, Wilson snatched off his mask and, according to Cobb, said something about beating my head in. At Collins' urging, Cobb returned to the bench, where he had a drink of water, fussed with his glove, and then sat on the bench with a soft drink, no doubt a Coke. At that point, Wilson turned to the near-capacity crowd and declared the game forfeited to Boston. Emil Fuchs, president of the Braves, and Al Lang, a prominent St. Petersburg businessman and sports promoter, rushed onto the field and hastily arranged for a second game. Cobb refused to participate. With Mac's approval, Cobb sat out 3 subsequent Athletics-Braves games that spring because Wilson was umpiring. In one of those encounters, on March 23rd at Fort Myers, the Athletics razzed Wilson so hard that he chased every player on the Philadelphia bench, 15 in all. Cobb watched the spectacle from the stands. A couple of days later, the commissioner's office notified him that he would have to pay a $100 fine for his run-in with Wilson at St. Petersburg. In Philadelphia, the fans could rest assured that Cobb's presence on the ball field would generate as much electricity as it always had. Cobb did play in several other exhibition games against the Giants and minor league teams before leaving Mac's ball club at Waycross, Georgia, so he could drive to Augusta, drop off his automobile there, and take a train north with his family. Minus Ty Jr., who was already enrolled in prep school at Princeton, New Jersey, the Cobbs arrived in Philadelphia on April 2nd and moved into a house Cobb had leased in Kinwood, an exclusive Philadelphia suburb to the northwest of the city. The next day, he debuted before about 5,000 of his new home fans in the opener of the annual spring series with the city's woeful National League team. Playing the whole game in rain and sleet, Cobb did nothing at bat, got caught stealing once, and muffed a foul fly. His team won anyway, 5-1. He played all the way in the remaining 4 games of the city series, and to bring in a little more money for Mac, and maybe for himself as well, he also went the full 9 innings in exhibition games at Baltimore and Newark. By opening day, he had again brought himself around to top physical condition. In what was described as his slow, drawling manner, he told the Knights of Columbus at their luncheon in the Hotel Adelphi that he was enjoying the happiest days of my baseball career. He would always be grateful to the team and the city that took me to its heart in my darkest days last winter. On April 12th, the Athletics opened the season in New York. 72,000 people, according to Ed Barrow, packed Yankee Stadium for what turned out to be a historic occasion. The game itself was nothing extraordinary. The Yankees knocked out lefty Grove and went on to win 8-3 behind Waite Hoyt. Cobb, batting third and playing in right, received a floral horseshoe from the Georgia Society of New York City, and a big ovation when he came up in the first inning and proceeded to ground out. His one hit of the day was a bunt single in the sixth, after which he took third on Sammy Hale's single and center fielder Earl Combs' wide throw to third, and scored on Dudley Branham's single. The historic significance of the game had to do with the presence of no fewer than 13 future Hall of Famers. Mack and Huggins as managers, Cobb, Collins, Wheat, Grove, Al Simmons, Jimmy Fox, and Mickey Cochran among the Athletics players, Ruth, Hoyt, Lou Gehrig, and Herb Pennock among the Yankees. In evaluating the Athletics prospects, the baseball press tended to dwell on the team's graybeards. Besides Cobb, Collins, and Wheat, Mack had Jack Quinn, a 42-year-old right-hander who had compiled 180 wins over 18 seasons in the American, National, and Federal Leagues, and would last 7 more years in the big time. Connie Mack appears to have an interesting but not highly valuable collection of antiques, wrote the New York Times' James R. Harrison. Collins and Cobb are not covering half the ground they did 10 years ago. The key to the team's future, though, was in youngsters like Cochran, Simmons, Fox, Grove, Bishop, and Boley, and in veteran but still relatively young players like infielder Jimmy Dykes and outfielder Edmund Bing Miller. Simmons was already an established star, a powerful right-handed hitter who, despite an awkward foot-in-the-bucket style, had batted .384 and .343 in the past 2 seasons. Cobb befriended Simmons, sometimes shared a room with him on the road, and offered batting tips. But not even Cobb would risk tampering with Simmons' way of hitting. Cobb's new team was a good one, possessing the ingredients for the powerhouse that would win 3 pennants and 2 world championships, 1929 through 31. In 1927, however, the Athletics and the rest of the league were up against maybe the finest team ever assembled, with Ruth hitting 60 homers to break his own record, and Gehrig adding 47 and driving in 175 runs. The Yankees piled up 110 victories, won the pennant by 18 1/2 games, and then swept Pittsburgh in the World Series. Whether or not the Athletics had a realistic chance for the pennant, Cobb intended to go full tilt and leave no doubt that he was really earning the biggest bi-monthly paychecks in baseball. At Washington, he made 7 hits in 3 games, and in Game 2, stole home on rookie right-hander Alvin Crowder. As Washington sports writer Shirley Povich described it, Cobb beat the throw easily, breaking into a broad smile as he bounded to his feet after the slide. That was the highlight of the Athletics' 3-1 win. Cobb was hitless in the home opener on April 20th, an 8-5 victory over New York, before a capacity 35,000. But he had 2 hits the next day, a 13-5 drubbing by the Yankees, and then tripled, singled, and stabbed Combs' drive against the fence in the final game of the series, which Philadelphia won 4-3. 4 days later at Boston, Cobb hit 2 singles and a double, and drove in 2 runs. With the bases loaded in the 7th, he picked his spot and stole home on pitcher Tony Weltzer, hook sliding around catcher Grover Hartley. He ended the game by tearing in from right to take a line drive, and then beat the runner back to first for an unassisted double play. All in all, a remarkable game for a 40-year-old. A week later at Shibe Park, the Athletics were trailing the Red Sox by a run in the bottom of the 8th, when Cobb hit one over the right field wall into 20th Street for an apparent home run. Referring to an old, rarely used rule, plate umpire Red Ormsby called it a foul ball because it veered foul after leaving the park. Cobb put up something of a protest. Simmons, the on-deck hitter, complained at such length that Ormsby threw him out. Cobb then resumed his position in the batter's box, but just as the pitcher started his motion, he jumped out and back, bumping Ormsby with his shoulder. At that, despite Cobb's insistence that the bump had been accidental, Ormsby also ejected Cobb. When the game ended 3-2 in Boston's favor, fans threw bottles and seat cushions, and Ormsby had to leave under police escort. Upon reading Ormsby's report of the Philadelphia fracas, Van Johnson, back from his furlough, quickly notified both Cobb and Simmons that they were under indefinite suspension. Cobb was livid when he found Johnson's wire waiting for him in Cleveland. Although he did not plan to play there anyway, because he had pulled a muscle in an exhibition game at Buffalo on the way, he regarded the suspension, levied by the man who had recently tried to ease him out of the league, as more shabby treatment from Johnson. "It's all a mystery to me," he said. "I've stood for a lot of things in the past, but I'm not going to stand for them any longer." Cobb's admirers in Detroit were just as upset, because his suspension interfered with their plans for a big homecoming for the Georgian when the Athletics moved into Navin Field on Tuesday, May 10th. Telegrams of protest poured into Johnson's Chicago office. Johnson, in St. Louis, commented that Cobb's offense, in particular, is a serious one, inasmuch as he had not only shoved Ormsby, but then incited the crowd against the umpire. After losing 3 straight at Cleveland with Cobb and Simmons in the stands, the Athletics took a Lake Erie steamer over to Detroit. Waiting to greet Cobb at the boat dock was a delegation led by Mayor John T. Smith and James O. Murfin, Cobb's attorney in the controversy over Leonard's charges the previous winter. Cobb was escorted to the Masonic Temple for a luncheon in his honor. Connie Mack, Fielding Yost, longtime University of Michigan football coach, and George Moriarty, Cobb's old teammate and his successor as Tiger manager, were among the speakers. Toastmaster Murfin broke into the proceedings with the dramatic announcement that Johnson had just lifted Cobb's suspension, as well as that of Simmons. Ty Cobb Day at Navin Field could go off as planned. Cobb then rode in a police-escorted motorcade to the ballpark. Despite a threat of rain and uncertainty about whether Cobb would play, 27,410 came out to Navin Field. Besides the inevitable floral horseshoe, Cobb received a new automobile and a silver service from his well-wishers in pre-game ceremonies broadcast by a local radio station. His first time up, with Collins on first, he lifted Earl Whitehill's pitch into the small overflow in right, limped into second, and then limped much faster coming home on Simmons's hit. Many of the same people who the previous summer had hooted him any time he left the dugout now stood and cheered lustily. When he went out to right field, he walked up and down in front of the temporary bleachers, signing dozens of autographs and holding up the resumption of play. Later, he drew a walk, struck out, and hit into a force-out. With the Athletics safely ahead, he retired after 7 innings in favor of Bill Lamar. Ty Cobb Day ended with a testimonial dinner given by the Intercollegiate Alumni Association of Detroit. The next day, Cobb and Simmons got word from Johnson that they would have to pay fines of $200 each for their part in the disturbance at Philadelphia. Shrugging off that irritation, Cobb doubled twice in the Athletics' 3-1 victory at Navin Field, doubled again in a losing effort on May 12th, and in the last game at Detroit, beat out a bunt, subsequently stole third, and almost stole home but missed the plate. In the midst of a hitting streak that eventually stretched to 21 games, he was batting around .400 and playing as zestfully as ever, albeit not as recklessly. The Athletics' hopes of overtaking the Yankees were all but ended May 30th through June 2nd, when New York won 4 of 5 games before big crowds at Shibe Park and moved 6 ahead of the locals. Although the White Sox were just back of the Yankees at the time, they soon began to fade into the second division. By the end of June, New York was already so far ahead that the pennant race was virtually over. Philadelphia, Washington, and Detroit were left to jockey for second, third, and fourth. On June 18th, Cobb strained his back and hip, running out a ground ball. Except for a few pinch-hitting appearances, he was sidelined for nearly 2 weeks. In his third game after getting back into the lineup, at Boston against the hapless Red Sox, he executed his 10th theft of the year and his third of home, beating Del Lundgren's pitch and again hooking around Grover Hartley. After slumping badly in June, he began to sting the ball again on a western trip. At Detroit on July 19th, he reached another career milestone when he lined one of Big Sam Gibson's pitches for a double, and thereby collected his 4,000th hit in the majors. It was a mark that for many decades would look absolutely unattainable by anyone else. In that less record-fixated time, Cobb became aware of his achievement only when he read about it in the late editions of the afternoon Detroit papers. This was the Ty Cobb of 10 or 12 years ago, marveled Henry P. Edwards after watching an old-fashioned exploit at Cleveland's League Park the following week. Reaching first on an error, Cobb then pulled off a delayed steal, a rarely seen maneuver by 1927, and made it all the way home on Luke Sewell's throw over an unguarded second base, and then center fielder Bill Jacobson's wild throw to the plate. When Edwards asked him about that play while they waited through a rainout the next day, Cobb remarked that he couldn't understand why younger ball players didn't take more risks. Attributing the lack of daring in today's game to the lively ball, he went on to wonder aloud what the likes of LeJoie or Crawford would have been able to do with it. Baseball was no longer played scientifically, he lamented, nor was there as much hustle as in the old days. Too many second-division teams let down as soon as they dropped from contention. How foolish that was, because the club owners would reward hard work. But you can't tell that to every player and have it sink in. Cobb showed Edwards and other Cleveland onlookers what he meant by hustle when play resumed on July 24th. Late in the first game of a doubleheader, which the Athletics swept, he came all the way in from right field to cover home on a rundown play, and ended up taking Grove's return toss of Dyke's wild throw in a vain attempt to tag a sliding Indian runner. Yet he got tired, very tired. Besides spending as much time as possible in bed while on the road, he went to a lighter bat, 34 to 36 ounces now, as opposed to 40 ounces in past years. He also began carrying a portable phonograph with him on road trips, after he found that listening to a half hour or so of music by the famed concert violinist Fritz Kreisler helped him to relax. After a game, he undressed slowly, took a leisurely shower, and usually left the locker room after everybody else. Carefully conserving his energy and particularly his troublesome legs, Cobb continued to be a pronounced asset to his team. Late in July, Simmons tore a groin muscle and was out for 6 weeks. Mack moved Cobb to center field and into the cleanup spot in the batting order. Walter French went from left to right. Zach Wheat took over in left and hit well, although he and Cobb had to chase after many drives that went between them. Cobb, after going hitless in 20 at-bats, the worst slump in his career, broke out with a home run and single to drive home 2 in a win over the White Sox at Shibe. That was the start of a hitting surge that included a 17-25 performance in 6 games against Chicago and St. Louis in mid-September. In the 3 games against the White Sox, moreover, he stole 4 bases. Despite the loss of Simmons, the Athletics were a hot club in August and September. By winning 36 of their last 49 games, while Washington and Detroit were obligingly having losing streaks, they took firm possession of second place. So firm, in fact, that after going 0-6 in a September 21st doubleheader against the Browns, and then failing in 3 times up over 5 innings against Cleveland the next day, Cobb left the game, showered and dressed, and returned to the dugout to say goodbye to Mack and his teammates. With a wave to some friends sitting in nearby box seats, he left the ballpark with his wife. With Mac's blessings, he had decided to get away early and attend to some hunting. Again, he was going out to the Grand Teton country, this time accompanied by Charlie. On their way, they intended to stop off in Chicago for the heavyweight championship rematch between Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey. Along with more than 100,000 others at Soldier Field, they would gasp as Tunney went down and took the fabled long count in the 7th round, before rising to continue outfighting Dempsey and retain his title. Cobb's baseball future was very much up in the air when he left Philadelphia. Mac had given him a cordial invitation to return, he told reporters before his last game, but he wasn't sure what he'd do. As he had been saying for 6 or 7 years, he acknowledged getting old and not being able to step around the way I'd like to. Still, I've played baseball ever since I was 16 years old, and it's pretty hard to break old habits. Certainly, his campaign of vindication had been a resounding success. Appearing in 133 of his team's 154 games, he finished with a .357 batting average, 5th best in the league. Harry Heilman won the 4th and last of his odd-year titles, hitting .398. Cobb knocked in 95 runs, hit 5 homers, and stole 22 bases. Only Bob Musell of the Yankees, 24, and George Sisler of the Browns, 26, had more steals. It had been a solid season for a man of 40 years, or any age. Stan Baumgartner, a former athletic pitcher and now a local sports writer, quoted Mac as crediting Cobb with the team's second-place finish. Rumors that some of his players were unhappy because they thought Cobb had played for his own statistics were bunk, said Mac. I never handled a finer baseball man, one who gave me less trouble than Cobb. Yet because of the Yankee runaway the past season, and of course, the continuing absence of Sunday baseball at home, the Philadelphia franchise had not made much money despite the team's excellent performance in the last part of the season. Whether or not Mac actually paid Cobb the $20,000 World Series bonus, as he later said he did, the Athletics were in no shape to carry Cobb at the same salary for 1928. Cobb and his wife returned from their hunting and camping excursion at the beginning of November. After a couple of weeks in Wyoming, they had decided to try northern Arizona as well. All told, Cobb had shot 2 brown bear, 2 elk, 2 deer, and an antelope, the largest haul he'd ever made hunting big game. Instead of heading straight for Augusta, they traveled to Philadelphia by way of Detroit, where Cobb told reporters, I am sound physically, but there's no telling what might happen if I tried to drag on. The word he got from Mac when they met in Philadelphia was that the ball club simply could not afford him. Cobb would remain on the Athletics reserve list and have to be waived in the usual way. But the club would not interfere in whatever deal Cobb might work out for himself elsewhere. Back at the Bellevue Stratford, Cobb invited a group of reporters up to his room. Well, dearie, I've been released, he greeted his wife. I'm glad of it, she said. Of course, Cobb had not actually been released. That would come only if nobody claimed him on waivers. One thing, I do not have to worry, he told the newsmen. Whatever happens, I'm going to consider my own wishes and comfort first. The interview was interrupted when 17-year-old Ty Jr. burst into the room, having caught a train down from Princeton to see his parents for the first time since September. Already 6 feet tall and weighing about 175 pounds, the Cobb's firstborn played guard on his prep school football team, although tennis was his first love. Then the Cobbs went home. In fact, Mac never asked waivers on Cobb, although he undoubtedly would have if Cobb had wanted to sign with another team. In January, when Cobb was in Washington to straighten out some personal income tax matters, he remarked, I have been in harness long enough. Asked whether he might consider managing again, he answered sharply, being a manager is a lot of grief. You never know when someone is going to chop your feet out from under you. 12 days later, in Augusta, he confirmed that he had received offers from 2 other clubs, rumored to be the St. Louis Browns and the Chicago Cubs. Evidently, John McGraw was no longer interested in him. No, Cobb said, he wasn't dickering with Mac. He still wasn't sure whether or not he wanted to come back. Meanwhile, Clark Griffith at Washington, also having gone through a disappointing year at the gate, gave Tris Speaker his unconditional release. Like Cobb, Spoke had come back in the aftermath of the Leonard furor to have a fine year. Playing all season as the Senators' regular center fielder, he had batted .327 and fielded his position capably, although he no longer covered the vast expanses he once had. Early in February, after talking by telephone with Mac, who was down at Fort Myers golfing and making arrangements for spring training, Speaker signed to play in 1928 with the Athletics. Baseball pundits put his salary at around $30,000, but in all likelihood it was substantially less than that. Cobb remained unsigned, by Mac or anybody else. The Athletics manager said repeatedly that he'd like to have Cobb for another year, but only if he took a sizable cut. Toward the end of February, Mac let it be known that he had just received a long letter from Cobb and, "I really think he is going to be with us again. I don't care how many games he plays," added the Dean of Baseball Field Leaders, "just so he's on the team." On his way to Florida to open spring training, Mac stopped off at Augusta to talk with Cobb and make him a definite offer. Subsequently, Thomas Scheib, Athletics president, called to urge him to come into the fold. On March 1st, Cobb wired Mac in Fort Myers that he accepted his terms, which he described to the press as highly satisfactory to me. While he'd had other offers, all along he'd had his mind made up to play for Philadelphia if he played at all. Mac's kind persistence had finally persuaded him. Cobb's willingness to play another season defies rational explanation. Although neither he nor Mac ever disclosed his salary terms, they probably provided for less than half of what he had been paid in 1927. Cobb no longer had anything to prove. His play the previous year should have given him as much vindication, as much demonstrated proof of both his dedication to the game and his durable talents as anybody needed. While his batting eye was still sharp, the legs were about gone. Beating out bunts, going for the extra base, sliding on much scarred thighs and hips were painful things for a 41-year-old man to have to do day after day. Crippling injury was more of a threat now than ever. In recent years, moreover, Cobb had often complained of not having more time for his family, and particularly of not being able to take a summertime vacation when they could all be together. Yet again, he was ready to take up the disruptive routine of a professional ball player. What it all came down to was that after 23 major league seasons, Cobb was just not ready to retire. Coming back in 1928 had nothing to do with money, with setting more records, or with anything else, except Cobb's emotional need to stay in uniform. Instead of making the trip to Fort Myers right away, Cobb decided to work out locally with the New York Giants, who were training in Augusta in 1928. He would join the Athletics later when they came up for a scheduled game with the Giants. At Augusta, Cobb took the field only after the Giants were through for the day, promising to coach anybody willing to pitch batting practice for him. Among those who lingered to get hitting instruction from Cobb was Frank Lefty O'Doul, a fun-loving San Franciscan who had failed in the American League as a pitcher and then come back up as an outfielder. Cobb worked with O'Doul mainly on loosening his grip so he could manipulate the bat and line the ball to different fields. O'Doul stuck with the Giants that year and went on to lead the National League in hitting twice, with Philadelphia and Brooklyn, and compile a .349 career average in the majors. Russell Red Reeder, a rookie catcher who also sought Cobb's help, remembered him as a smart, crafty, dynamic, and intense batting instructor. Ty Cobb absorbed you. You became his pupil. When he was talking, if you were absorbing the instruction, his eyes glittered. When the Athletics got into Augusta on March 16th, Cobb and Charlie went to the team's hotel to renew acquaintances, especially with Collins, Speaker, and their wives. While they were there, Shirley Cobb, now 16, and a friend came in to beg Cobb to pass up the ball game that afternoon and come watch Shirley perform in a horse show. Cobb, though, was determined to be in uniform with the team. 3 innings into the game with the Giants, he took over for Walter French in right. Playing the rest of the way, he popped up and hit into a force out. Cobb returned to Florida on the train with the team. In games against the Giants and the St. Louis Cardinals, he performed spiritedly alongside Speaker in center and Simmons in left. Zach Wheat had been released over the winter, but the Athletics still had Collins, Cobb, Quinn, and now Speaker in the 40-plus range. Including coach William "Kid" Gleason, who had led the White Sox in 1919 through 23, Mack employed no fewer than 4 ex-managers. While Collins intended to play only occasionally in 1928, Cobb and Speaker were supposed to be regulars. Those two, plus Simmons, had hit for a combined average of .358 in 1927. It was apparent to those who watched the Athletics closely that spring, however, that a Cobb, Speaker, Simmons outfield would be the slowest in the league. Wrote the New York Times' Richard Vidmer from Florida, "The Athletic outfield situation simmers down to 2 important items. Cobb can't come in, and Speaker can't go back." Cobb had been with the ball club less than a week when he received word at Fort Myers that his wife was about to undergo surgery at an Augusta hospital. After assuring Mack that he would rejoin the team in Philadelphia in time for the series with the Phillies, Cobb hurried north in a rented car. Charlie Cobb's surgery, probably undertaken to repair damage done by 5 childbirths, of which the last 2 had been quite difficult, lasted about 2 hours and was termed a complete success. Cobb stayed on in Augusta until April 2nd, sparring with reporters about how much he had recently made in the stock market, how sound his legs were, and how many games he would play. When he left for Philadelphia, his wife was out of the hospital, but still in need of several weeks of convalescence. So, alone, Cobb arrived to start his 24th big league season. After playing every inning of 3 games against the Phillies and 1 at Baltimore, he pronounced himself in the best shape in years. Mack put him down to start in right field in the season opener against New York, with Speaker in center and Bing Miller in left in place of Simmons, who was hospitalized with tonsillitis and rheumatoid ankles. Some 25,000 people gathered in cold, misty rain at Shibe Park to see their favorites open the season against New York. In a close replay of the 1927 opener, the Yankees got to Lefty Grove and his successors for 8 runs, while their own pitcher, Herb Pennock, held the Athletics to 3. Cobb, hitting second, singled his first time up and waited out Pennock twice. 2 days later, after a cancellation because of the cold, the 2 teams hit 3 home runs apiece, Lou Gehrig's winning it 8-7. Cobb had 2 hits and 2 runs driven in. On April 16th, when the Athletics lost their 3rd straight to Washington at Shibe, Washington sports writer Frank Young heard scattered jibes, mostly directed at Cobb, after balls dropped between him and Speaker. The 2 would have to hit .350 each, thought Young, to make up for their ground-covering shortcomings. For a while that spring, it seemed as if Mack's middle-aged outfield tandem might do just that. In the Yankees' home opener, played before 55,000, the fans jeered Cobb when he lost a fly ball and was thrown out trying to go from first to third on Speaker's hit, and Speaker as well when he failed to get under a short fly. But with the score 1-1 in the top of the 9th, the pair won it for Grove, Cobb hitting George Pipgrass's pitch for a triple over Earl Combs's head, and Speaker following with a sacrifice fly. That was the Athletics' first win after 4 losses. Both Cobb and Speaker, particularly Cobb, continued to hit with customary authority for the next several weeks. Each had a bases-loaded triple in a 10-0 shutout, pitched by 43-year-old Jack Quinn at Washington on April 26th. The game ended, moreover, when Cobb fielded a bloop base hit and threw to second, where Speaker was waiting to put the tag on an oversliding Aussie Blue. Cobb was full of fire during Detroit's first stay at Shibe Park. Besides razzing Earl Whitehill unmercifully until the Athletics knocked him out, Cobb singled twice, stretched another hit into a double, and scored from first on a wild throw. The next day, he singled and doubled and scored ahead of Speaker's homer to provide the winning margin over the Tigers. In the Monday finale, Cobb and Speaker each drove in a run in Grove's 10-0 whitewash. Against Cleveland the next week, Cobb hit his first and only homer of the year into 20th Street, beyond Shibe Park's right field fence. Yet even though he pulled off double steals with both Speaker and Max Bishop in that series, to Gordon Cobbledick of the Cleveland Plain Dealer he seemed pathetically slow. After their poor start, the Athletics won 21 of their next 25 games, and pulled well in front of everybody except the Yankees, who were even hotter than the year before. New York remained 3.5 games up, after the two teams split a doubleheader on Thursday, May 24th, before a Philadelphia crowd that not only filled every seat, but sat in the aisles and on the steel girders, stood in a roped-off area in left, and swarmed over the fence in right when the gates were finally locked. On Friday, before a turnout that merely occupied all the seats, the Yankees took both ends of another doubleheader. They also won on Saturday to leave town leading by 6 1/2. For the second year in a row, they had come into Philadelphia relatively early in the season, taken 4 out of 5, and put the Athletics at a disadvantage they could never make up. New York remained 3.5 games up after the two teams split a doubleheader on Thursday, May 24th, before a Philadelphia crowd that not only filled every seat, but sat in the aisles and on the steel girders, stood in a roped-off area in left, and swarmed over the fence in right when the gates were finally locked. On Friday, before a turnout that merely occupied all the seats, the Yankees took both ends of another doubleheader. They also won on Saturday to leave town leading by 6 1/2. For the second year in a row, they had come into Philadelphia relatively early in the season, taken 4 out of 5, and put the Athletics at a disadvantage they could never make up. Speaker had to stop playing regularly after he was banged up in an outfield collision with Bing Miller on May 21st. Cobb, suffering from what was described as nervous indigestion, yielded right field for a 3-game series in Boston to rookie George Mule Haas, but he was back in the lineup on June 2nd at Chicago. Meanwhile, Simmons had finally returned, taking over left field while Miller moved into center, and Speaker accepted his new role as bench warmer and occasional pinch hitter. That was not for Cobb, at least not yet. He was hitting well above 300 and still capable of a trick or two. On June 15th, in the 8th inning of a game at Cleveland, he hit a bad bounce double by Lou Fonseca at first base to drive in Grove and took third on Bishop's groundout. With the Athletics safely ahead, he caught relief pitcher George Grant not paying attention to him and came in under Luke Sewell's tag for a clean steal of home. That was the 35th time in regular season play he had successfully completed baseball's most difficult offensive maneuver. It was also to be his last. The trouble was that for all his cleverness and savvy on the bases and the field, he just could not compensate for his failing legs. In that same Cleveland series, he twice hit line drives off the screen atop the field in right, and both times had to stop at first. In New York a few days later, he made 3 hits, but also fell on his face going after Ben Pascal's bounding single and let in 2 runs. Now, he regularly grounded into double plays, something that almost never happened 10 years ago. It was harder and harder for him to take the extra base. Even outfielders with mediocre arms managed to throw him out. On July 18th, in a game against Detroit at Shibe Park, Cobb took a pitch from Sam Gibson on his right wrist and had to leave in the 4th inning. Up to then, he had rapped out a single, but also got picked off first by Gibson and later played Charlie Gehringer's hit off his chest into the right field corner for a 2-base error. After a few days, The wrist had healed enough for him to pinch hit and strike out against Washington to end a game that broke an Athletics winning streak at 7. 2 days later, he played both ends of a doubleheader at Chicago. The day after that, July 27th, he singled and doubled to help pile up a lead for Grove, before White Sox reliever George Sarge Conley hit him in the right side of the chest with a pitch and forced him to give way to French. X-rays, taken when the team got to St. Louis, revealed nothing broken, but Cobb was badly bruised and so sore he could barely lift his right arm. That game in Chicago, Cobb's 86th in 1928, was his last as a regular. At that point he was batting .332. His slowness afield, though, was such a drawback that when he was ready to play again, Mack decided to stay with the younger and more mobile outfield of Simmons in left, Miller in center, and Haas in right. Meanwhile, Mack had finally made hard-hitting Jimmy Fox his regular third baseman, and was alternating Jimmy Dykes at first against left-handers with Joe Hauser against right-handers. Playing at a torrid pace, the Athletics had gained so much ground on the injury-riddled Yankees that a pennant had come to seem a real possibility. So Cobb took his place on the bench with Speaker and Collins, 3 men from another era who had once battled each other fiercely and now sat watching a new generation of ball players play a different kind of baseball. For the first time since the early part of the 1906 season, Cobb found himself a substitute, and an infrequently used one at that. On August 28th, he made his first appearance in 2 weeks, striking out as a pinch hitter in the nightcap of a doubleheader sweep of the White Sox at Shibe Park. When the Athletics played an exhibition game in a minor league town to try to make up some of the money lost by not having Sunday home dates, not only Cobb, but Speaker and Collins as well would appear to fatten the crowd. Stripped of his first baseman when Dykes and Hauser were both injured, Mack turned not to Cobb, who had gained a fair amount of experience at the position in exhibition and spring training games over the years, but to Ossie Orwald, a good-hitting rookie pitcher. To Cobb's credit, he understood that Mack was in the midst of a pennant race, and could ill afford to play him or anybody else out of sentiment. Besides, going out there every day had come to be, as he later put it, hellishly hard. On September 7th, Mack's newly constituted ball club gained a tie for first place by winning 2 from the Red Sox, while New York lost to Washington. The Yankees won the next day, but in sweeping another doubleheader at Boston, the Athletics took a half-game lead, the first time one of Mack's teams had been in first place that late in 14 years. That set up a climactic 4-game series in New York. On Sunday the 10th, the largest crowd in baseball history up to then, put at 85,265 by Ed Barrow, jammed Yankee Stadium to see George Pipgrass shut out Philadelphia 5-0 in the first game of a doubleheader. And the Yankees take the second game as well, 7-3 on Bob Musel's Grand Slam homer. 51,000 were there on Tuesday, as Ruth hit a 2-run homer, his 49th, in the bottom of the 8th inning, to break Lefty Grove's 14-game winning streak 5-3. The Athletics salvaged the 4th game before some 35,000 on Wednesday, 4-3, on Bishop's 9th inning homer. Having lost 16 of 22 games with the Yankees that year, Mack and his men left New York with pennant hopes sagging. They pulled to within half a game of first a few days later, but the Yankees just kept winning. At Detroit on September 28th, they clinched their 3rd straight pennant. Cobb's last time at bat in American League competition came on September 11th, in the 3rd game of the series in New York. After Ruth's homer put the Yankees up 5-3, Mack sent Cobb up to hit for Dykes at the start of the 9th. He lifted a pitch from Henry Johnson back of 3rd, where shortstop Mark Koenig easily made the catch. Cobb did make 2 more appearances in an Athletics uniform. On September 13th, in an exhibition game at Albany, New York against the local Eastern League team, he played 5 innings and hit 2 singles. And the next day, In still another stop on the circuitous route the Athletics took from New York to Cleveland, Cobb went most of a game at Toronto and again singled twice. Only about 2,000 people saw his last outing as a member of a major league ball club. During the Athletics' stay in Cleveland, on September 17th, Cobb summoned the baseball writers on hand and announced that he would retire at the end of the season. He assured the skeptics who had listened to him talk retirement for years that this time he meant it. Never again, he told the writers, will I be an active player. It would be hard to leave the game that had paved the road to lift me to a place of prominence and affluence. But the past season had been hard labor. I'm just baseball tired and want to quit. Why, I scarcely know my children, he admitted. The time had come to get out of the game and play with my kids before they grow up and leave me. Besides, he had promised his wife a trip to Europe. Connie Mack, he went on, was the squarest man in baseball, a manager for whom it had been a privilege to play. 10 days later, as soon as they learned that New York had clinched the pennant, both Cobb and Speaker packed their bags in Chicago and said goodbye to Mack and the rest of the team. Speaker was on his way to join a hunting party in Wyoming. When he returned, he would sign to manage Newark in the International League. Cobb caught a train for Detroit and a session with his dentist. In such an unspectacular way, Cobb's long, tempestuous, glittering career came to an end. Following his vindication year, the 1928 season had been an anticlimax, one in which he simply extended the numerous career records he already held. Through July, it had been a tough but respectable season. After that, he had been an onlooker most of the time, while the ball club made its pennant bid. In 95 games and 353 times at bat, he hit .323. His hits, which included a homer, 27 doubles, and 4 triples, were good for 40 runs batted in. His old legs carried him to only 5 stolen bases, but at least there was that last satisfying theft of home at Cleveland. The American League's official records gave Cobb 3,033 games played, 4,191 hits, 2,245 runs scored, 893 stolen bases, and a lifetime batting average of .367. At the time he retired, moreover, he had the most career runs batted in, 1,933, and the season record for stolen bases, 96 in 1915. He was also second to Speaker in career doubles, 725, and to Sam Crawford in triples, 294. In 11,429 at-bats, Cobb had struck out just 357 times, about once in every 32 official plate appearances. As Walter Johnson and lots of other pitchers had complained, it had been hard to get a strike past him. A man who loved figures, whether baseball or financial, Cobb would remain highly cognizant of his own and others' records in the long years that followed his departure from the game. He would often surprise interviewers with his mastery of baseball statistics, which, in highly selective fashion, he liked to quote in his ongoing quarrel with the game as it had developed since 1920. There would be many interviews, many opportunities to press his case against baseball, a lot of time to ruminate on what had been, and begrudge what was. Altogether too much time. 12. Just looking in doesn't help. For the very few people who manage to become highly successful professional athletes, the period following retirement from active competition is almost inevitably anticlimactic. That was especially true for Ty Cobb. It was as a baseball player that the public knew him, and that he knew himself. As he often freely acknowledged, he had no vocation besides baseball, knew no other way to organize his life. In terms of his own emotional well-being, Cobb would probably have been better off if he had not retired as the first millionaire ball player. Needing to work to support himself and his family, he might have been able to bring his day-to-day existence into some kind of focus. As it was, he never really adjusted to a retirement that lasted 33 years. Without baseball's exacting but predictable demands, its clearly measurable achievements, its springtime renewal of hopes, its glamour and drama, Cobb found life difficult. Later on, Babe Ruth understood Cobb's predicament, because it was his as well. Usually much less articulate than Cobb, Ruth nonetheless said it best. It's hard to be on the outside of something you love. Just looking in doesn't help. After the 1928 season, Cobb effectively put off coming to terms with his retirement when he went to Japan to appear in a few games with Japanese university teams and to conduct a series of clinics. Since about 1910, various groups of college players from the United States and Japan had exchanged visits, and enthusiasm for baseball was running high in the Asian nation. Herb Hunter, a former outfielder who had failed to stick with various major league teams, promoted the trip and guaranteed Cobb $15,000 for his services as player and instructor. So early in October, accompanied by his wife and the youngest 3 Cobb children, Herschel, Beverly, and James Howell, Cobb embarked from Seattle aboard the SS President Jefferson. To assist him in demonstrating how the game should be played, Cobb took along Bob Shockey, one-time Yankee ace, and Fred Hoffman, veteran catcher with the Yankees and Red Sox. Ernie Quigley of the National League staff would demonstrate umpiring. At least in terms of the public interest it generated, the trip was a big success. Cobb played first base most of the time in Japan, but also occasionally relieved Shockey on the mound. Crowds of up to 20,000 Japanese turned out for the games Cobb played in. And one of his clinics, at Waseda University, drew 4,000 would-be ball players. The Japanese impressed Cobb with their eagerness to learn, at the same time that they mystified and amused him by playing strictly according to form, always doing the same thing in the same circumstances. Cobb and his teammates, repeatedly pulling the unexpected, ran up football-sized scores on their bewildered opponents. After stopping off for about a week in Honolulu, Cobb and his party arrived at San Francisco in the first part of December. By mid-month, the Cobbs were back in Augusta. That winter brought the customary bird hunting and a few field trials with his dogs. When spring training time came around, Cobb grew a bit restless, but then realized, he said, that he was free to go anywhere and do anything he wanted. What he did was fulfill an old promise to his wife by taking her on an extended European trip. En route through Philadelphia, he stopped off to wish Mac and the Athletics luck and pick up his last year's uniform. In New York, they took passage on the SS Roosevelt. For months, Ty and Charlie Cobb toured the southern and western parts of the continent in the best guidebook fashion, seeing, Cobb thought, half the museums in Europe. After that, they visited England and finally Scotland. Near Keith, Scotland, he shot grouse and quail with Sir Isaac Sharp, internationally renowned as a trainer of pointers and setters. For Cobb, it was the big league of upland bird hunting. The Cobbs arrived in New York Harbor on October 1st, in plenty of time for the World Series, which began a week later at Chicago, between the Athletics and Cubs. Just before his return, the Philadelphia Bulletin began serializing a collection of reminiscent pieces he had dictated for the afternoon daily during his stopover in the spring. Again, Cobb praised Mac unstintingly. He was the supreme master of the diamond, the greatest manager our national game has known. Mac, Cobb said, had made him believe he could help the Athletics when he thought he was through with baseball, and had been willing to pay him more than he was really worth. He'd never have anything but pleasant recollections of his 2 years with the Athletics. His only regret was that he hadn't put in all of his 24 years in the majors with Connie Mack. If Cobb had any regrets about not hanging on for one more year, and thereby getting into one more World Series, he kept them to himself. In 1929, Mack's array of talent had finally gelled into one of the game's all-time great teams. In the opening game, Howard Emke, with whom Cobb had never got along as either player or manager, was Mac's surprise starter. The 14-year veteran proceeded to strike out 13 Cubs, a new series record, en route to a 4-1 win. 6 days later, the Athletics wrapped it up, 4-1 at Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Cobb told reporters that he'd had offers from several clubs to become either an executive or a field manager. Although he wasn't ready to rule out managing altogether, the executive end of the game had the most appeal because, he joked, an executive can hide in his office or get under the stands. However, I never thought I was such a bad manager as many people thought. In Europe, being out of baseball hadn't really bothered him. But now that I'm back, it's different. He even went so far as to say he thought he'd be in baseball next year. In fact, Cobb would never get back into baseball in any official way. He had long since severed his connections with the Providence and Augusta teams. For a while, early in 1928, he had thought about heading up a group to buy the San Francisco Seals in the Pacific Coast League. But then he signed to play another season and had to write George H. Manus, a Detroit public relations man who was promoting the project, that I will have my hands full with the Athletics. Just before he left for Europe, according to veteran sports writer Fred Lieb's recollection, Cobb made an offer of $275,000 for the Cincinnati Reds franchise. Such a deal may still have been cooking when Cobb returned from his trip, which would explain his remark about being in baseball in 1930. Cobb's bid was eventually rejected, Lieb has written. If so, it was a fortuitous outcome for Cobb, at least financially. The coming of the Great Depression sent baseball attendance plummeting and brought big losses for most major league clubs, including the habitually second-division Reds. One franchise that continued to thrive in the Depression years was Detroit's. Although the Tigers' home attendance was second only to that of the Yankees in the early 30s, Frank Navin had lost the bulk of his personal fortune in the stock market crash in the fall of 1929. By 1933, he had told co-owner Walter Briggs that he was ready to sell the ball club for $2 million to a syndicate headed by Cobb's longtime Detroit friend, James O. Murfin, and including Cobb as a major investor. Briggs vetoed the sale, however, and he and Navin continued to control the Tigers until shortly after the 1934 World Series, which the Tigers lost in 7 games to the St. Louis Cardinals. At that time, Navin died after suffering a heart attack while horseback riding. Briggs bought Navin's shares in the franchise and went on to operate it for nearly 25 years. So Cobb remained on the outside looking in. In a later period, he might have put his supreme knowledge of how to hit to use as a batting instructor. It was not until near the end of his life, however, that ball clubs started to employ such coaching specialists. For that matter, if the designated hitter rule adopted by the American League in 1973 had been in force in 1929, he might have stayed on as a player for a few more years, even with his sore legs. In the circumstances of the 1930s, though, Cobb's baseball options were severely limited. The consensus among big league owners continued to be that he had demonstrated with the Tigers that he lacked the qualities of a successful manager, whatever those qualities might be. Conceivably, he could have managed in the minors, as Speaker was willing to do, or been a minor league club executive. But that would probably have meant buying some debt-ridden franchise. Ever penny-wise, Cobb was not about to make a losing investment just for the sake of having a new project to occupy himself. What he ended up doing was spending a small part of his time dealing in stocks and real estate, and trying to make his former off-season recreations, hunting, fishing, golfing, fill up the rest of his days. His fortune suffered some from the stock market crash that hit the nation's and the world's economy within 2 weeks after the 1929 World Series. Yet Cobb's investments proved to be sufficiently distributed in soundly operating businesses so that he came through the panic in good shape. The backbone of his stock holdings, General Motors and Coca-Cola, held up throughout the Depression years. Even in the depths of the economic downturn in 1932, GM continued to pay a dividend. Coca-Cola turned out to be depression-proof. While others sold, Cobb steadily increased his holdings in both GM and Coca-Cola, as well as in the American Can Company, Timken Roller Bearing, and other businesses. At the end of a decade of generally hard times, Cobb had seen his personal wealth at least double. Mainly because of his experience in the Depression years, he came to believe that, as he later phrased it, what's worth buying is worth holding. On December 18, 1930, Cobb marked his 44th birthday, the last, as it happened, he would ever spend in the house at 2425 William Street in Augusta. When asked about reports that he would buy or become an executive with this or that ball club, he said that for now, his dickerings with everybody in baseball were over. He was content to serve as recreation director for the city of Augusta, a post he had recently agreed to take. Before long, though, he intended to move his family from Georgia to the San Francisco Bay Area. He had been in love with that part of the country ever since managing 2 seasons in the California Winter League during the early 20s. At the beginning of March 1931, Cobb played in his first officially organized golf tournament. After shooting an 83 over the 18-hole Augusta Country Club course and beating a local businessman for the Winners' Cup, he left for the West Coast to look for a suitable house for the Cobb family. Early in April, he was on hand to take part in ceremonies inaugurating the San Francisco Seals' new $1 million stadium. 8 days later, he was golfing at Del Monte near Monterey when he was notified that Charlie Cobb had filed for divorce in Augusta. Her suit charged cruel treatment within the meaning of the law and of such character as to warrant a total divorce. Cobb told newsmen that he was shocked, didn't know what to say except that I have always loved my wife, my children, and my home. Cobb could hardly have been shocked, nor could intimates of the family. The Cobb's marriage had been deteriorating for some time, probably even before Cobb left baseball. Just as he had been a hard man to play with and for, so he was a hard man to live with. Possessed of a restless, sensitive, mercurial disposition, even in his palmiest baseball days, he was even more given to temperamental behavior now that he found himself with so much time and not enough to fill it with. For years, his family had had to put up with his periods of brooding and outbursts of sarcasm and anger. Cobb was a healthy, energetic, middle-aged retiree who in almost any other profession would have been at the height of his powers. As a rich ex-ball player, though, he lacked much of anything to do with himself. After a quarter-century of relentless driving to become the best and remain the best, of fighting off Nap Lajoie, Joe Jackson, Eddie Collins, Tris Speaker, and Babe Ruth, trying to stay ahead of them, as he once put it, it was just not possible for a man like Cobb to settle comfortably into the roles of paterfamilias, solid citizen, and baseball elder statesman. Cobb was no ogre. He did not physically abuse his wife and children. Always primarily a man's man, he appears to have resisted the baseball groupies of his time and remained faithful to his marriage vows. James Howell Cobb, called Jimmy, the baby of the Cobb family, described his father as a strict disciplinarian who was sparing in his praise, especially of his 3 sons. He pressured all of his children to do well in school and withheld their privileges whenever their grades fell down. But Jimmy Cobb also remembered his father's tucking him in at night and playing catch with him in the backyard, as well as Cobb's worry that the undersized Jimmy would get hurt playing grade school football, or that Beverly, the next youngest Cobb child, would somehow be injured in archery classes. Cobb's main difficulty as a parent had to do with Ty Jr., who was a major disappointment to his father. Whereas Herschel, born in 1916, played baseball avidly and well until he suffered an eye injury when he was 11, Ty Jr. disliked the game and took up tennis while attending Richmond Academy in Augusta, and then the Hun School in New Jersey. At Princeton University, he played more tennis, drove flashy cars, had a good time, and flunked out. Subsequently, at Yale, he captained the varsity tennis team and did a little better scholastically, but still did not manage to finish his bachelor's degree. Ty Jr.'s checkered collegiate career coincided with Cobb's first few years out of baseball, and doubtless contributed to the strain on the Cobb marriage. Eventually, Cobb and his son became totally alienated from each other, an outcome for which Cobb came to hold the boy's mother responsible. In obvious ways, Cobb's relationship with Ty Jr. paralleled what his own relationship with W.H. Cobb had been, and might have become, despite Cobb's unquestioned success in baseball, if his father had lived. In April 1931, after Cobb hurried back to Augusta, he and Charlie agreed to try to hold their family together. At the end of the month, he announced that his wife had withdrawn her divorce suit. She had done that on her own initiative, and no further comment is to be made on account of the sacredness relating to her decision. At least for the time being, the marriage remained intact. Cobb went back to California to resume his systematic search for a place that would combine roominess, seclusion, and convenience at a good price. He found what he was looking for at 48 Spencer Lane, in the little town of Atherton, about 22 miles south of the San Francisco city limits, and 3 miles or so from Menlo Park, which would be the Cobb's mailing address. The Atherton home was actually a small estate, a 15-room, 7 bedrooms house in the Spanish Mission style, complete with swimming pool, guest house, and servants' quarters, located on several acres with plenty of trees to conceal the house from the street. Into that house, Cobb moved his family in 1932. Presumably, it was where he intended to live out his days, surrounded by loved ones and friends, enjoying his wealth and leisure. In California, he played golf most of the year at the many courses built in the Bay Area over the past 2 decades, in response to affluent America's discovery of the game. He hunted wildfowl in California and big game in Idaho, Wyoming, and Canada, fished in mountain streams, and even tried his hand at polo. He also continued to make money. His famous temper was frequently in evidence, both in public and private circumstances. He stormed around golf courses, impatiently demanding to play through other parties of golfers he considered incompetent or too slow. He went at polo with a fierceness that dismayed his gentlemanly teammates and opponents. At the Detroit Athletic Club in 1935, he was dining with Grantland Rice when Nig Clark, the old Cleveland catcher and now a Detroit resident, came over and joined them. Clark entertained Cobb and Rice for a while by telling how he had sometimes swiped at sliding runners he couldn't reach, and then nonchalantly tossed aside his equipment to fool the umpire into thinking the tag had been made for the 3rd out. But when Clark laughed and confessed that he'd even gotten Cobb called out a couple of times with that tactic, Cobb bolted from his chair and began cursing and violently shaking Clark, until Rice pulled him off and the stunned Clark left the room. In October of the next year, Cobb's mother died in Georgia at the age of 65. She was buried near her husband in the cemetery at Royston. Cobb's sister Florence had been crippled for a long time with arthritis and was unable to look after herself. She ended up living most of her remaining years, until her death at 51 in 1944, at her brother Paul's place at Sarasota, Florida. She spent one period, however, with the Cobbs in California. There, Cobb often waited on her himself, and was usually as kind and considerate as anyone could be. On other occasions, however, even his bedridden sister did not escape his biting sarcasm, especially on the subject of her fondness for radio soap operas. In the mid-30s, baseball's leaders, most notably Ford C. Frick, a former sports writer who had become president of the National League, hit upon the twin ideas of establishing an official gallery of the game's immortals and making 1939 baseball's centennial. A small baseball museum already existed at Cooperstown, New York, where, according to the folklore that the game's officialdom had long ago accepted as fact, Abner Doubleday had laid out the first baseball diamond in 1839. That museum was to become the basis for a much bigger museum incorporating a Hall of Fame, a place of enshrinement for baseball's greatest names and of pilgrimage for devout fans. By the end of 1935, Henry P. Edwards, now Secretary of the American League Service Bureau, was polling the 226 members of the Baseball Writers Association of America to select the first group of immortals. The writers were to choose from a list of 33 players, all of whom had made their records primarily or exclusively after 1900. Later on, a BBWAA Veterans Committee was to pick men from the pre-1900 years. To be chosen for the projected Hall of Fame, a player had to be named on at least 75% of the ballots. Early in February 1936, Edwards announced that Cobb had received 222 votes, only 4 shy of unanimity. Babe Ruth, who had just retired the previous year, and Honus Wagner were tied for second with 215. Christy Mathewson, 205, and Walter Johnson, 189, were the only others named on the necessary 3/4 of the ballots. Interrupted with the news on the golf course, Cobb was gracious. "I am overwhelmed. I'm glad they felt that way about me." If he held any resentment at the perversity of the 4 writers who had refused to vote for him, he kept quiet about it. Jimmy Cobb believed that his father was prouder of that Hall of Fame vote than of anything else connected with his baseball career. The completed National Baseball Museum and Hall of Fame was dedicated on June 12, 1939. Some 10,000 visitors jammed Main Street in the little upstate town for the ceremonies. Since 1936, 2 more BBWAA polls had added Nap Lajoie, Tris Speaker, Cy Young, George Sisler, Eddie Collins, Willie Keeler, and Grover Cleveland Alexander to the first class of Hall of Fame inductees, as well as 13 pre-1900 figures chosen by the Veterans Committee. Of the 20th century performers, all but Mathewson and Keeler were still living. 9 of them, together with 76-year-old Connie Mack, were on hand for the ribbon cutting at the entrance to the museum, and then for the induction ceremonies, with Ruth arriving just as the band was striking up "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Cobb was nowhere to be seen. At the ceremonies, the picture-taking sessions afterward, or the baseball game played by 2 groups of contemporary major leaguers that afternoon at the little ballpark the town had built nearby, supposedly on the site of Doubleday's primal act. "Ty's late, just as he always was for spring training," quipped one of the old ball players. Complaining of train delays and misconnections, Cobb finally arrived late in the day, in the company of 19-year-old Beverly and Jimmy, now nearly 18. At least he would be able to make the Hall of Fame banquet. 20 years later, he admitted that he had purposely missed the noontime ceremonies to avoid having to be photographed with Commissioner Landis. Cobb would never forgive Landis for not moving with dispatch to clear his name back in 1926. At Cooperstown, Cobb renewed acquaintances with Ruth, whom he had seen from time to time over the past decade, and visited in New York on a few occasions. Cobb had developed a real fondness for this man who was so different from him in so many ways. Loudmouthed, gluttonous, and coarse, Ruth, as Cobb had discovered, was nonetheless ultimately charming and eminently likable. Whereas Cobb had been unable to work out a satisfactory business deal that would bring him back into baseball, Ruth had waited in vain for somebody to ask him to manage a major league team. Thus, besides talking over old times, Ruth and Cobb could commiserate on how tough it was no longer to be a part of the game that had been their lives for so long. Still another tie between the 2 men was Claire Merritt Hodgson Ruth, the former showgirl whom Ruth had married in 1929, after the death of his long-estranged first wife. Claire Ruth was the daughter of James M. Merritt, a prominent Georgia attorney and sometime University of Georgia law professor, who had occasionally handled legal matters for Cobb. In Georgia, she later wrote, I had known Ty Cobb very well. In the summer of 1941, Cobb and Ruth, both dedicated golfers who usually shot in the 80s, agreed to play a series of 3 matches, with all proceeds to go to charitable causes. Exactly who first challenged whom is a matter of question, but the press quickly seized on the idea of a showdown on the links between the 2 greatest ball players and ballyhooed it to the hilt. Arranged by Fred Corcoran of the Professional Golfers Association, the matches would supposedly pit the Babe's power versus Cobb's cunning and skill. When Cobb got to New York on his way to the Boston area for the first match, sports writers told him that Ruth had been working hard and shooting great golf. If Cobb needed anything to stimulate his competitive juices, that did it. I went into those Ruth matches as determined to win as I ever was on the ball field, he said later. The rivalry between Cobb and Ruth, John Kieran observed, was real enough. It sticks out all over the 2 contenders. Weighing 212 pounds and described as a picture of health at the age of 54, Cobb teed off against the 46-year-old Ruth on June 25th at the Commonwealth Country Club in West Newton, Massachusetts. Betty Davis, the movie star, was present with a trophy she had donated for the winner. Cobb's superior putting was the difference. His 18-hole score was 80, Ruth's 83. The proceeds from the $1 per person admissions went to a farm operated for underprivileged New England children. 2 days later, at the Fresh Meadows course on Long Island, with proceeds targeted for the USO, Ruth and Cobb tied after 18 holes. Ruth took 5 strokes to Cobb's 6 on the playoff 19th hole to go even with Cobb in matches. They were to play the 3rd match on June 29th at Grosse Ile Golf and Country Club outside Detroit. Throughout the series, but especially for the deciding match, Cobb later maintained, he used psychology on the ingenuous Babe. In a practice round at Cleveland, he deliberately missed shots, bemoaned his poor performance, and generally behaved as if he thought he didn't have a chance at Grosse Ile. On the steamer trip across Lake Erie, Cobb recalled, Ruth was so confident that he downed considerably more scotch than would be good for his game the next day. Whereas only a couple of hundred spectators had bothered to watch the 2nd match, some 2,500 were on hand at Grosse Ile, with the proceeds again to go to the USO. While Ruth sweated out last night's booze and shot poorly in the intense heat, Cobb played his average game. It took him only 16 holes to clinch the match at 15 over par. Ruth was 19 over. Malcolm Bingay, who for many years was on the staff of the Detroit News, came out to see if the years had dimmed the fierce competitive spirit of Cobb. What he saw convinced him otherwise. That evening, Cobb celebrated winning what he termed the Has-Beens Golf Championship of nowhere in particular by throwing a dinner at the Statler Hotel for such old friends as Bingay, H.G. Salsinger, and William Kunzel, longtime photographer of Detroit sights, including Cobb's diamond feat. That evening, Cobb celebrated winning what he termed the Has-Beens Golf Championship of nowhere in particular by throwing a dinner at the Statler Hotel for such old friends as Bingay, H.G. Salsinger, and William Kunzel, longtime photographer of Detroit sights, including Cobb's diamond feats. Another of Cobb's guests was Major James Doolittle, Air Reserve Corps, who had been a Cobb fan while growing up in St. Louis. Within a little over 9 months, Doolittle would be leading a carrier-based strike of 16 B-25 bombers against Tokyo, doubtless flying over some of the same ball fields on which Cobb had taught the game to young Japanese. By the time their son Jimmy finished at New Mexico Military Institute and entered the Army in 1942, Ty and Charlie Cobb had long since stopped being husband and wife in any but the legal sense. After the family moved to California in 1932, Charlie Cobb had filed for divorce on 2 more occasions, only to change her mind both times. She and Cobb continued to live together in the Atherton home until August 1939, when she left Cobb and moved into a place of her own in Menlo Park. Their 2 daughters, who had not yet married, divided their time between their separated parents. Early in 1942, about 2 months after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, Ward Morehouse, doing a piece for the Sporting News, visited Cobb at Atherton. Larry Woodall, Cobb's second-string catcher in the 20s, and Roy Corrin, once a light-hitting shortstop for the White Sox and Cardinals, were there as his golfing guests. Cobb told Morehouse that he had established legal residence in Nevada and kept the Atherton place mainly to entertain people. Recently, he had bought a lodge on Lake Tahoe, accessible from U.S. Highway 50 between State Line and Glenbrook, south of Carson City. After showing the journalist around the main house, Cobb took him out past the unfilled swimming pool to his sports house, which was crowded with baseball and hunting trophies and other mementos, including pictures autographed by famous personages. Cobb said he prized most a photo of Woodrow Wilson signed, "To my friend Ty Cobb, 1913. Although he had a Filipino house servant, Cobb himself insisted on making sardine sandwiches for his guests' lunch. While he drank bourbon and ate sardines, he talked about the Asiatic mind and how tricky the Japanese were. In 1928, somebody had stolen his uniform, glove, and baseball shoes from his room at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. "I've always thought the things were stolen to be copied by a manufacturer," he said. "That's the way those fellows are." Although he had the company of his daughters and occasional guests and hunting, fishing, and golfing companions, Cobb was now basically by himself. The Atherton house was far more than he needed, and he spent an increasing amount of his time at the Lake Tahoe place, which over the years he enlarged and improved. He was at dockside in San Francisco to greet Jimmy when his son returned from the Pacific region early in 1946. But Jimmy had to hurry off to Twin Falls, Idaho, to join his wife and baby. At Twin Falls, moreover, his brother Herschel was waiting to make him a partner in the local Coca-Cola bottling plant, in which Cobb had helped set up Herschel several years earlier. In March 1947, at Redwood City, California, Charlie Cobb filed her 4th and last divorce action. Represented by Melvin Belli, a young San Francisco attorney, who would later become a celebrated criminal lawyer, she now alleged extreme cruelty from the date of marriage to the present time. Besides half of Cobb's wealth, a putative $7 million, she asked for $5,000 per month in alimony and $60,000 for attorney's fees and other costs. Cobb acknowledged not being surprised this time around. The estimate of his estate, though, was just too big. He was probably telling the truth, although the war-triggered economic revival and the post-war continuation of the boom had made him a substantially richer man. As Belli predicted, the Cobbs eventually reached agreement out of court. The easiest way out was for them to agree on a property settlement, for her to withdraw her suit in California, for Cobb himself to file suit in Reno under Nevada's liberal divorce laws as a resident of the state, and then for her to sign a waiver giving jurisdiction to the Nevada courts. That was the way it was all done, so that by the fall of 1947, the divorce was final, ending 39 years of marriage. The terms of Cobb's settlement with that old woman, as he now referred to her, never became public. It was generally a bad period for Cobb, what with the final breakup of his marriage, the publicity surrounding the divorce, and the continuing antagonism between himself and Ty Jr. Hearing about the deaths of men he had played with and against reminded him of his own mortality and advancing age. Fat Roy Fothergill had died in 1938. Lou Gehrig succumbed to a rare disease of the nervous system in 1941, 2 years after taking himself out of the Yankee lineup and ending his incredible consecutive games played streak at 2,130. Dan Howley died in 1944, Bobby Veach the next year, Walter Johnson late in 1946. It was also saddening to stop off in Greenville, South Carolina, on the way to New York with Grantland Rice, following the Masters golf tournament in Augusta, and discover Joe Jackson working behind the counter at a little liquor store, and obviously consuming about as much as he sold. At first embarrassed to say anything, he finally brightened up when Cobb started talking about Jackson's beautiful swing and natural hitting ability. A few years later, Jackson too would be dead. Early in 1947, it became known that Babe Ruth had throat cancer. That year and the next, the Yankees staged a total of 3 commemorative occasions for the dying baseball idol. The second was on Sunday, September 28, 1947, the last day of the season, when Yankee President Larry MacPhail arranged a 2-inning game between old Yankee ball players and old-timers from other American League teams, with all proceeds to be turned over to the Babe Ruth Foundation for Boys. Cobb was one of 40 or so former players coming to New York to participate in the game and visit with Ruth, who was barely able to whisper his thanks to the crowd of 25,000 during pre-game ceremonies. After renewing acquaintances with such old foes as Tris Speaker, Cy Young, Ed Walsh, Frank Baker, George Sisler, Billy Evans, and even Bill Bradley, his favorite player when he was a kid in Georgia, Cobb led off the contest against Waite Hoyt. Just before stepping into the batter's box, he told Wally Shang, catching for the Yankee old-timers, that it had been a long time since he'd swung a bat, and he was afraid it might slip out of his hands, so maybe Wally should move back a few feet. After Shang obliged, Cobb assumed his familiar stance with hands apart on his bat. Hoyt tossed one in, and Cobb bunted neatly in front of the plate. His ploy was unsuccessful, though, because before his 60-year-old legs could get him to first, Shang fielded his bunt and threw him out. At first, Cobb winced in disgust, then seemed to remember that it was all for fun, and broke into a big grin as he puffed back to the visitors' dugout. That old-timers game was the last time Cobb saw Ruth alive. After a final appearance at Yankee Stadium the next June, the Babe died in New York at 53 on August 16, 1948. I can't honestly say that I appreciate the way in which he changed baseball, Cobb remarked toward the end of his own life. But he was the most natural and unaffected man I ever knew. I look forward to meeting him someday. A few years after Ruth's passing, death came to Cobb's immediate family. In April 1951, Herschel Cobb suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 34, leaving a wife and 3 children. About a year and a half later, Ty Jr., 42, died of a malignant brain tumor at his mother's home in Menlo Park, where, hopelessly ill, he had come to be taken care of. In the late 1930s, Ty Jr. had finally settled down. Deciding on a career in medicine, he gained admission to the Medical College of South Carolina at Charleston. In 1942, he finished his MD with a specialty in gynecology and obstetrics, married Mary Frances Dunn of Daytona Beach, Florida, and set up practice at Dublin, Georgia. There he continued to practice and live with his wife and children until the brain tumor was discovered in 1951. Not long before he died, Ty Jr., the boy who had not liked baseball, was finally reconciled with his famous father. In the years that followed Ty Jr.'s death, Cobb often lamented that as a ball player, he'd not had as much involvement with his family as he should have. When you get older, you wish for companionship, he said. I was just a loner. I couldn't have that with my children. If he'd gone into medicine and become a surgeon, it might have been different. He'd have been able to talk over operations with his physician son. But I was a ball player, and my son had no inclination toward baseball. In his 60s, Cobb's own health remained reasonably good, even though he had about abandoned cigars and now smoked cigarettes steadily. He also tended to drink more as the years passed. One reason his weight crept up to 230 pounds at one time. In June 1946, while he was in Detroit for the Golden Jubilee of the American automotive industry, he was briefly hospitalized with acute bronchitis. A year and a half later, he spent a few days at the Leahy Clinic in Boston, being treated for a gallbladder flare-up. In June 1949, after a month's hospitalization at Stanford University Hospital for the same condition, he came out relieved to have avoided surgery and weighing a trim 186 pounds. By then, Cobb was involved with a project that was taking up a considerable amount of his time and providing a great deal of personal satisfaction. In 1945, he had decided that as a memorial to his parents, he would make it possible for his hometown of Royston to have its own modern hospital. Cobb said that he wanted to benefit not only the townspeople but also Stuart D. Brown, M.D., his boyhood friend and teammate on the Royston Reds, and one of Georgia's outstanding country doctors. So he donated $100,000 and began lengthy discussions by mail and telephone with Brown, Charles S. Kennedy, a physician acquaintance in Detroit, and various architects and contractors. Facilitated by a $72,000 grant from the federal government and about $38,000 in contributions from local people, the hospital project went forward at a good pace. In January 1950, Cobb flew across the country to be on hand for the dedication of the Cobb Memorial Hospital. It had 25 beds, and according to Superintendent Brown, was filled with the latest equipment. This hospital belongs to all of you people here, where I used to live, Cobb told the crowd of about 3,000. And it's for you people, whom I've always had in my heart. Then came the formal opening of the hospital, with the gold key turned by Frances Fairburn Cobb, the benefactor's 40-year-old wife of 4 months. An attractive brunette, Cobb's new mate was the daughter of John Fairburn, a Buffalo, New York physician whom Cobb had known for some years. The marriage to Cobb at Buffalo on September 24, 1949, was her third. She had lost one husband in an airplane crash in 1934 and had recently divorced another. He'd not intended to marry again, Cobb told newsmen after the wedding. But then he'd met Frances, a rare woman who liked to golf, hunt, travel, and cook. So at 62, he had taken another wife. Cobb's contacts with baseball remained peripheral. He corresponded regularly with George Weiss, his friend from Weiss's days as owner of the New Haven Colonials, and now general manager of the Yankees. Cobb reported to Weiss about prospects he had seen in his travels, assessed the Yankees' pennant chances, and even suggested trades Weiss should make. For 3 weeks of the summer of 1951, Cobb was guest instructor at a boys' baseball camp in the Ozarks. The next year, on his way home from fishing in the upper Columbia River region, he came by Sixth Stadium in Seattle, got into the batting cage, and demonstrated that at 65 he could still wrap line drives. Later that same summer, before a Dodgers-Giants game at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, he showed a young Dodgers catcher how to drop a handful of dirt at a batter's feet when the pitch came in, just as Nig Clark had done it half a century earlier. In July 1951, the Subcommittee on the Study of Monopoly Power of the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee held hearings on the old question whether organized baseball, through its reserve clause, operated in violation of the antitrust laws. Cobb came all the way from Nevada to be the lead-off witness before the subcommittee, chaired by Representative Emanuel Seller of New York. Wearing reading glasses and frequently cupping his ear to hear questions from subcommittee members, Cobb testified for about an hour and a half. Mostly, he entertained the congressman with stories from his early baseball years. The players of today, he wanted the congressman to know, weren't up to those of his time. When asked about the issue at hand, he stoutly defended the basic reserve clause, although he did suggest a plan he had first talked about as early as 1908. After 5 years under contract to one ball club, a dissatisfied player ought to be able to take his case before a board of arbitration, and if the board ruled in his favor, become a free agent. In general, though, Cobb endorsed the status quo. Baseball, he declared, has made it possible for hundreds of young men from small towns like myself to improve their lot in life and become useful members of their communities. I revere baseball. Whether he was testifying before a congressional subcommittee, giving an interview, or just having a casual conversation, Cobb usually could not resist comparing baseball then and now, always to the discredit of the present-day version. Years before his retirement, he had started carping about the way the game had changed, particularly about the baneful effects of home run-oriented baseball. He continued in the same vein as a retiree. Finally, in 1952, Life magazine paid him $25,000 to put his complaints down in sustained, systematic form. In a 2-part article, he blasted just about everything connected with the game at mid-century. Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, and most of the other stars of today, he argued, couldn't have hit the top in the old days. The trouble was that they limped along on one cylinder, swinging for the fences, not using their talents to the fullest, unwilling to pay the price to be as good as they could be. Phil Rizzuto, the Yankees' hard-driving little shortstop, and Stan Musial, the Cardinals' batting star, were the only present-day performers who could stand comparison with the old-timers. The Red Sox Williams, though a fine natural hitter, obstinately pulled the ball and thereby lost numerous base hits. DiMaggio of the Yankees let himself get out of shape in the off-season and consequently suffered more injuries than he should. Today's overpaid athletes lolled around during the winter months and otherwise neglected their careers in ways that make my flesh crawl. As a whole, they just weren't as tough as Cobb's contemporaries. To an old-timer like me, Cobb grumbled, today's ball players seem like a particularly fragile lot. The men of his day had been a strange, hard-bitten, and ambitious crew, up from the small towns and by no means eager to go back, trained at nothing but that one profession, and battling to hang on to it to their last breath. Cobb also had nothing but contempt for the current practice of giving unproven teenagers huge bonuses for the inability of most ball players to bunt, and despite his own player switching when he managed, for the obsessive platooning done by today's managers. Above all, he abominated fence swingers. It seemed to Cobb that, given the proper physical equipment, which consists solely in the strength to knock a ball 40 feet farther than the average man can do it, anybody can play big league ball today. With everybody trying to hit home runs, base stealing was almost a thing of the past, and brute power ruled the game. In other words, science is out the window. The counter-arguments of various sports writers and managers that today's baseball was a basically different game from that of the dead ball era, and that any evaluation of the sport now had to take into account such new factors as night play and relief pitching specialists, carried no weight at all with Cobb, if he even bothered to read them. As some of his critics pointed out, he had seen relatively little major league competition since moving to California. His assault on present-day baseball and ball players was patently unfair in a number of ways. But Cobb went to his grave convinced that the game's most glorious years had been his own as a player. Maybe out of a deep need to maintain as much of a living connection with that time as he still could, Cobb started going back for the Hall of Fame inductions and reunions of old ball players. Beginning in 1951, he made the long trip to Cooperstown every 2 years or so. Sid Keener remembered seeing Cobb, Cy Young, Ed Walsh, and Connie Mack walk arm in arm from the stately Otesaga Hotel to the 1953 ceremonies. Getting Sam Crawford into the Hall of Fame became something of a cause for Cobb. Although Cobb and Crawford had never cared for each other personally, Cobb had always admired his old outfield mate's ability and achievements. He talked up Crawford's qualifications when he was at Cooperstown, and regularly wrote letters to the BBWAA Veterans Committee urging his admission. In 1957, Crawford was finally voted into the Hall of Fame. He arrived from rural California in the company of Davy Jones. When Crawford, Jones, and Cobb sat together and swapped reminiscences at the annual banquet, the rancor that had marked their years as teammates seemed forgotten. A much bigger cause for Cobb in the 1950s was the Cobb Educational Fund, which he announced at a press conference in Atlanta late in 1953. A three-person board of trustees, chaired by Daniel C. Elkin, M.D., professor of surgery at Emory University Hospital, would administer Cobb's endowment of $100,000. Named for Cobb's father, the fund would provide scholarships for needy Georgia residents wanting to attend college and definitely would not be athletic. Recipients would have to make it through their freshman years on their own before they could qualify for a CEF scholarship. Cobb's intent was to help only those who showed a determination to succeed. The Lincoln-esque characters, the boys and girls out of the fields and mountains. We want stars. Stars in medicine, in law, in teaching, and in life. We want to be identified with their success. His motives, he said, were selfish ones. I feed on the warm feeling that I have inside me. By all indications, the Cobb Educational Fund, like the little hospital Cobb had given to the town of Royston, was a successful venture. 31 students were on CEF scholarships in 1958. When people came to interview him, Cobb would usually oblige them by going over the same baseball yarns he had been telling for decades. Speaking quietly with an accent that was no longer deeply Southern, he sometimes seemed to tire and lose interest in talking about the past. But when the subject of his scholarship fund came up, he would become animated, and his eyes would glitter as they had when he taught hitting. The work of the students had been phenomenal, he told a visitor in 1958. Although he had met only about 10 of the scholarship recipients, he knew they were all the kind of people he originally had in mind. Pulling out dossiers on each of them, he talked glowingly about their progress and admitted a preference for North Georgia youth. I mean their faces, he enthused, as he showed pictures of several CEF scholars. They've got character. Besides his organized and public philanthropies, Cobb also did more than his share of individual, mostly private charitable deeds. After leading Detroit to 2 pennants and a World's Championship, Mickey Cochran had suffered a frightful beating in 1937. He never fully recovered from his head injury and was thoroughly down on his luck by the 1950s, when Cobb began sending him regular checks. Hearing that Lou Blue was dying in a Washington, D.C. hospital, Cobb helped pay his hospital costs and later gave money to his widow. George Leidy, who had taken Cobb in hand in Augusta in 1905, also received help, as did a number of other old ball players. Yet the same man who was capable of such quiet generosity had always tended to be suspicious, cheap, and cantankerous when dealing with people in service positions. His frequent quarrels with taxi drivers, parking lot attendants, hotel clerks, and restaurant personnel embarrassed his companions and anybody else within hearing distance. One of his Georgia kinsmen remembered an especially unpleasant scene in an Atlanta restaurant in the late 50s, when Cobb found a 3-cent error on a large bill for dinner and drinks. After the waiter and manager finally satisfied him that it had been an honest mistake, Cobb gave the waiter a good tip, and then went over to the orchestra, also tipped them handsomely, and left smiling. He also tended to brood over the past, especially when he was drinking. Early in 1955, he wrote Connie Mack, who 4 years earlier had finally turned the athletics over to Jimmy Dykes and was spending his last years in Florida. In an uncharacteristically shaky hand, Cobb again raked through the Cobb Speaker affair, which practically everybody had long ago forgotten. "I never wagered on a game in my life," Cobb protested. "Not even on our own club, which before 1919 Black Sox scandal was done openly." Ty Cobb never liked even that. He worshipped the game. He was reared different. He never once did wager. He never liked horse races or prize fights on account of the betting angle. His greatest regret, he reassured Mac, was not playing his whole career under him. "If only Mac knew how many times I have reflected and wished I could have come up with you in 1905 instead of that Navin. I still feel bitter about him." In the spring of 1955, John D. McCallum, a freelance sports journalist, came to the Lake Tahoe Lodge to conduct extensive interviews for a book on Cobb. Intending to do a combination popular biography and how-to-play book, McCallum had sought Cobb's cooperation. Unlike Gene Shore, whose carelessly done 1952 biography Cobb dismissed as worthless. In the time he spent with Cobb at Lake Tahoe and elsewhere, McCallum got a good idea of how rich Cobb really was. 3 or 4 mornings each week, he talked with his stockbrokers in San Francisco and New York. Just before McCallum left, Cobb disclosed that in the few weeks McCallum had been there, he'd made $375,000. On another occasion, he told McCallum that his fortune was now somewhere between $6 and $10 million. McCallum also had ample opportunity to discover just how difficult Cobb could be. When he was sober, McCallum recalled, he could be a very charming host. When drinking, there was the devil to pay. Unfortunately, he drank most of the time. Sometimes, Cobb would refuse to talk if McCallum tried to take notes. At other times, he ordered that something be written down exactly as he said it. Cobb had a little notebook wherein he kept a son-of-a-bitch list. Among the entries were Ban Johnson, Kennesaw M. Landis, and Dutch Leonard, all long dead, as well as his ex-wife, New York baseball writers in general, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the Democratic Party. Cobb was rabid on the subject of what had happened to the country since the Roosevelts and the New Dealers took over what had once been his party and turned it into a left-wing outfit. Later that summer, after McCallum had returned to New York, Cobb flew in for that year's Hall of Fame festivities. McCallum drove him upstate in an automobile borrowed from a New York GM executive. En route, Cobb and McCallum made a detour to reach a service station that gave green stamps. There, he took his companion to task for buying 7-Up from the soft drink machine, while Cobb, as always, spent his nickel on a Coke. At Cooperstown, Cobb first apologized for having to sit with the Hall of Famers at the banquet rather than with McCallum, then drank too much during the cocktail hour, bawled McCallum out for not sitting at Cobb's table, and ended up spilling a plate of roast beef in the writer's lap. Cobb's moods and tempers eventually became too much for Frances Cobb. She confided to McCallum that she feared her husband, especially when he was drunk. A few months before McCallum's arrival, she had filed a divorce suit in Reno, but had withdrawn the suit 12 days later. In September 1955, she filed again, charging extreme cruelty, entirely mental in nature. Cobb counterfiled, also alleging mental cruelty. The divorce was awarded to Cobb in May 1956 at Minden, Nevada, with Frances Cobb receiving the court's permission to resume the name Cass from her previous marriage. As in his first divorce, whatever financial arrangements Cobb agreed to remained private. Cobb was by himself more than ever now. From time to time, he was able to visit his rapidly growing number of grandchildren. That phase of his old age, at least, he seems to have enjoyed. He made several trips to Daytona Beach, Florida, where Ty Jr.'s wife Mary lived with her 3 children, and got to know them for the first time. With his own 3 surviving children, however, his relations were not good. Jimmy Cobb, now employed at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation down the coast at Santa Maria, and Shirley and Beverly, married but still living nearby, found it harder and harder to put up with their father's contemptuous attitude toward their mother and his general contrariness. "In this house, I'm just a lonesome old man," he told a visitor to his Atherton place in the spring of 1957. "All my interests are on the other side of those mountains," he added, gesturing eastward. "I want to build a house, hunt birds, and just visit." Georgia, he had decided, was where he wanted to live out his last years, in a place that would be uniquely his own. In Georgia, Cobb first looked for a suitable site around Royston. But with his boyhood pals Joe Cunningham and Stuart Brown now both dead, he soon discovered that there was not a great deal left for him there. He also seems to have balked at some of the real estate quotations he got. So he chose instead Cornelia, a town of about 3,800, located some 28 miles northwest of Royston, very close to his birthplace. Cobb came to Cornelia late in the summer of 1957. After staying for a time at the home of his second cousin, Harrison Gailey, he ended up at the town's only modern apartment complex. On Chenasataw Mountain, just north of town, he found a piece of land he liked. His view overlooked a lake in one direction, while across the hills to the south, one could barely make out where the little community called the Narrows had once been. Cobb wanted to live on that mountain and be by myself while I rest. He had to admit that he was old and tired. Only occasionally did he drive the 40 miles down to Athens to the nearest golf course. Mostly he slept late, watched TV quiz shows and Lawrence Welk's program, drove his housekeeper into town for groceries, attended the Christian church in Cornelia, and dropped in on Kiwanis and Chamber of Commerce luncheons. Once he got settled, he wanted to travel to colleges around the state and meet Cobb Educational Fund scholars. His house, he explained with enthusiasm, would be constructed of local stone and brick and have 8 rooms plus a guest house and servants' quarters. When it was finished, he just wanted to move in and belong. That's all this fellow Cobb wants here. For all his good intentions, Cobb, as an old man, was no better able to relax and remain in one place than he had been as a ball player during the off-seasons. Since July, he had been on the go, he wrote a friend from California in November 1957, crossing and recrossing the country 3 times and talking to architects and contractors. After another stay at Cornelia, where he had a partial excavation made for his house site, he was back on the coast in time to attend San Francisco's first Major League Baseball game, the home opener between the Giants, newly relocated from New York, and the Los Angeles Dodgers, who had forsaken Brooklyn over the winter. Late in June, Cobb was in Detroit for a Tiger Old-Timers night. Although he declined to don a uniform, he did acknowledge the cheers, take his seat in a box behind the home dugout off third, and patiently sign scorecards for a long procession of kids, probably few of whom had any real notion who he was. After 8 innings of such labor, he suddenly unlatched the gate leading from the boxes onto the field, and while the umpires held up the game, went into the Tiger dugout to say goodbye to everybody, before leaving the Detroit ballpark for the last time. If old and tired, Cobb had lost little of his combativeness. In 1958 through 59, he took on the state of California, which had billed him for nearly $52,000 in unpaid taxes and penalties. Cobb, said the California authorities, had failed to file state income tax returns from 1949 through 1957. The old man admitted as much, but argued that since the 1940s, his legal residence had been Nevada. Thus, California had no business taxing the personal income of a non-resident. With the state having already secured a lien on his Atherton home, Cobb had to post bond in the amount of his tax bill before he could appeal to the State Board of Equalization. In March 1959, the board ruled that Cobb had to pay. That he did, as he was obliged to under the law. But then, over the advice of his lawyers, he filed suit in Superior Court, seeking the return of the money. When advised
that the case would probably take years to come to trial. Cobb insisted that he was ready to stay in the courts as long as it took to obtain justice. Yet by the time he filed the suit on Christmas Eve 1959, Cobb must have understood that he did not have a great deal of time left for bringing the state of California to heel, for building a house in Georgia, or for doing much of anything else. As he had just recently found out, he had cancer. He would fight that foe with the same unyielding passion to win he had exhibited for a quarter century on the ball field. This time, though, not even Cobb's ferocious will could make any difference in the outcome. The discovery of the cancer dated from the fall of 1959. That September, Cobb was hunting birds a few miles from his Lake Tahoe lodge with Pete Buffering, a frequent hunting companion from Reno, when he suddenly experienced terrific pain in his back and legs. The pain almost paralyzed me, and I found myself unable to walk, he said later. For hours, Buffering half carried, half dragged him through the hills and ravines, before he finally got him back to the lodge and into his bed. Cobb would not let Buffering call a physician, insisting that he'd only had a flare-up of an old back injury. Buffering left him alone and in agony. A few days later, Frances Cass, having heard about Cobb's illness, arrived at the lodge. Although she still carried plenty of hurts and resentments from their marriage, she offered to take care of him. Cobb protested that because they were no longer married, she ought not to be there, but she stayed for 2 weeks anyway. By the time she left, she had managed to convince Cobb to enter the Scripps Clinic at La Jolla, California, for a thorough physical examination. The Scripps diagnosticians reported that Cobb had diabetes, a weak heart, high blood pressure, an enlarged prostate gland, and Bright's disease, a degenerative kidney condition. Cobb went back to Lake Tahoe with a supply of insulin and syringes for self-injections, as well as antibiotics, stimulants, strong painkillers, and instructions to follow a strict diet. Shortly afterward, George H. Manus, an old friend from Detroit, who had been chief organizer of the big banquet in February 1921, after Cobb became the Tigers' manager, happened to be in Reno with his wife. Upon hearing about Cobb, they immediately drove out to find him alone and a tired-out man. Yet Cobb greeted them warmly, and even cooked bacon and eggs for their dinner. He was always the perfect host if he liked you, Manus recalled. During the 3 weeks the Manuses visited with him, Cobb repeatedly kept them up past midnight, talking about his baseball days, his recently successful efforts to get Sam Crawford into the Hall of Fame, his pride in the Cobb Educational Fund youngsters, and numerous other subjects. He knew he was very sick and not getting any better. "My pain is so great, I never get a full hour's sleep any night," he told them. "The medicines and pills I take are no longer potent. Nothing kills the pain." So he had taken to consuming about a quart of Jack Daniel's bourbon, mixed with a quart of milk every day. "This has an effect of dulling somewhat my senses and nerves," was the way he rationalized his disregard for the dietary regimen he was supposed to be following. Dissatisfied with the Scripps Clinic's explanation for his ills, Cobb decided to seek another opinion. Early in December, Manus drove him from Atherton to the San Francisco airport, where he caught a plane for Chicago and a reunion with Ray Schalk, his longtime foe when Schalk was catching for the White Sox, but for many years now Cobb's faithful friend. From Chicago, Cobb flew to Atlanta to enter Emory University Hospital for examination by a medical staff he knew fairly well and was inclined to trust. At Emory, he was found to have not Bright's disease and not just an enlarged prostate, but a cancerous growth that had already spread rapidly from the prostate to other parts of his body. He soon underwent surgery for the removal of nearly all of his prostate, and then began a series of cobalt radiation treatments. When Manus welcomed him back at the Reno airport later in the month, he was walking well and seemed to feel better. One of the first things he did was file suit against the state of California for recovery of his taxes. Toward the end of January 1960, Cobb flew east again, to be honored first by B'nai B'rith of New York as one of the men of the age in sports, then by the New York baseball writers at their annual dinner. He gave every indication of being in good spirits and enjoying himself, even though another round of cobalt treatments awaited him at Emory as soon as he left New York. After resting at Cornelia for a couple of months, Cobb returned to Lake Tahoe. For some time, he had been supposed to start work on an autobiography, under contract to Doubleday and Company, and with help from a sports writer named Al Stump. Now, he was finally ready for Stump to come up from his home at Santa Barbara, California, so they could begin. Stump arrived to find Cobb in much worse shape than he had anticipated, and in an ugly mood most of the time. He ate very little and drank a great deal, particularly his whiskey milk concoction. As the Manus had learned, and as Stump now discovered as well, despite his enfeeblement, Cobb had no domestic help, having either fired or driven away a succession of servants. "I had a very sick and difficult man on my hands," Stump later said. Ty's family and ex-friends backed clear away from him. Stump came to feel that he was a combination nurse, keeper, and whipping boy. At no time was it easy. Stump's involvement with Cobb on the book project extended over parts of the next year. His published account of his experiences with the old man sometimes reads like a Gothic horror tale. Cobb kept huge sums of money at his lodge and with him whenever he went anywhere. He also kept a loaded Luger pistol on or near his person at all times, and on one occasion fired 3 shots into a darkened motel parking lot to quiet a group of rowdies who had disturbed a rare period of sleep. Stump's involvement with Cobb on the book project extended over parts of the next year. His published account of his experiences with the old man sometimes reads like a Gothic horror tale. Cobb kept huge sums of money at his lodge and with him whenever he went anywhere. He also kept a loaded Luger pistol on or near his person at all times, and on one occasion fired 3 shots into a darkened motel parking lot to quiet a group of rowdies who had disturbed a rare period of sleep. As Stump described his situation, he had little choice but to do Cobb's bidding, not only because he wanted to get the book finished, but also because he was often afraid of what Cobb might do if he refused. So, for example, one night they took a terrifying ride down the mountainside in a blizzard, so Cobb could hit the casinos in Reno. Sometimes gasping for breath, barely able to stand, Cobb nonetheless stayed around the dice tables for several days, quarreling with stickmen, bartenders, and other people, but winning consistently, about $3,000 in all. On an earlier trip into Reno, he told Stump, he'd won $12,000 in 3 hours. Obviously, his lifelong distaste for gambling had faded in Nevada's free and easy moral atmosphere. Not long after the Reno excursion, Cobb and Stump transferred their fitful literary efforts from Lake Tahoe to Atherton. There, Stump was astounded to find that Cobb had no electricity, his power having been shut off by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company because he had refused to pay a $120 bill. That amount was outrageous, Cobb protested. The house hadn't even been occupied during the billing period. He'd already had his lawyers file suit against the utility, he assured Stump. Working by a single electric bulb, hooked up with 200 feet of extension cord that was plugged into a neighbor's outlet, Stump managed to make some progress with Cobb on the book. But Cobb grew so weak, he had to enter Stanford University Hospital for more bombardments of cobalt. There, he managed to record a lot of his reminiscences by using a microphone suspended over his bed. In the strange nighttime quiet of the hospital, Cobb spoke to himself about his triumphs and heartaches in baseball a half-century earlier, when it seemed that the game, and life generally, had been better. With his cancer spread, slowed by the radiation treatments, Cobb left Stump on the West Coast and returned to Georgia. Nothing more had been done on his home site on Chenosital Mountain. Nor was Cobb any longer willing to pursue the project. The lush undergrowth soon covered over the excavation, covering all signs that a man had once started to have something built there. Cobb's ambitions had become short-term, to stifle the pain enough so he could get through a day, a week, to do something now that would take his mind off his deadly predicament. Late in June, he went to the Hall of Fame reunion. This would be his last visit to Cooperstown, he told Sid Keener, director of the Hall of Fame. "I'm a sick man and I know it." That night after the banquet, Cobb, using a cane and moving with considerable effort, walked with Keener from the Otisaka Hotel back to the exhibits building. They entered the Hall of Fame gallery, where Cobb stood looking at his plaque near the gallery front. Seeing that he was wiping away tears, Keener tried to comfort him. Cobb pulled away, said only goodbye, and moved unsteadily through the exhibits and out the front door of the building. That was the last time Keener saw him alive. Later that summer, Cobb decided that he wanted to take in the 1960 Olympic Games in Rome, and that he was strong enough to make the long trip. After talking with Harrison Gailey and various others about going with him, he finally persuaded Stuart Brown, Jr., who had followed his father into medicine and assumed directorship at Cobb Memorial Hospital following the elder Brown's death. Cobb and Brown flew from New York to Rome during the third week in August. Unaccountably, Cobb arrived with only $20 in his possession, and for their first couple of days in Rome, Brown had to run around to banks, getting grafts cashed on Cobb's Reno bank. But they managed to make it to the opening Olympic ceremonies on August 24th. Although Brown was prepared to give Cobb medical attention at any time, his strength held out well in the heat and pressing crowds. He even felt well enough to stay on by himself for the remainder of the games, when Brown had to return to the States after about 10 days. Cobb's fourth trip outside the North American continent, including the 1910 Cuban excursion, ended when his Boeing 707 landed at New York on September 10th. Then it was back to California and Nevada, and more sporadic work with Stump on the book that seemed less and less likely ever to see print. Late in the fall, he returned to Georgia, bringing Stump with him. After 4 weeks of cobalt treatment at Emory Hospital, Cobb again went to Cornelia to recuperate. On Christmas Eve, 1960, Stump drove him down to Royston so Cobb could see the gray marble mausoleum he had recently had installed at the local cemetery. The mausoleum contained the remains of Cobb's parents, disinterred from grave sites nearby, and of his sister Florence, moved from Sarasota, Florida. On the steps of the crypt, Cobb asked Stump to pray with him. When they entered, Cobb pointed out his father's tomb and talked for a while about his character and achievements. "My father was the greatest man I ever knew," Cobb said. "He was the only man who ever made me do his bidding." Then he added slowly, "My father had his head blown off with a shotgun when I was 18 years old, by a member of my own family. I didn't get over that. I've never gotten over it." It was possibly the first time in his life that Cobb had been able to say that much about how W.H. Cobb had died. Even then, he could not name his mother as the one who had pulled the trigger. At the insistence of his physicians at Emory, Cobb had taken a full-time nurse with him to Cornelia. She was supposed to make sure that he got his insulin injections and medications on schedule and followed a correct diet. But Cobb quickly rebelled against having his life managed, and particularly not being able to consume his daily quart plus of bourbon or scotch. By the time George Manus and his wife arrived at Cobb's apartment late in February 1961, he had discharged his nurse. Meanwhile, Stump had flown back to California. The dying old man was desperately lonely. He put up a good front, telling the Manus about his house plans and gesturing out the window in the direction of my mountain. But what he really wanted to talk about was getting the elderly couple to stay on, live with him on a permanent basis for $200 to $300 a month, plus all expenses. Manus had to answer that he and his wife were just too old to give him the kind of care he needed. "That was one of the hardest decisions I ever made," said Manus later. After a few days with Ray Schalk, who flew down from Chicago, Cobb had another round of treatment at Emory before returning to California. In a letter to Manus, he alluded to the recent death from cancer of the movie star Gary Cooper. "Mine is a slow type. Cooper's fast." He had taken on a ghastly look, the skin hanging from his once jowly face, and his weight now down to about 175 pounds, from the 210 or so he had carried before the onset of his illness. Yet he seemed to feel better, in fact, well enough to travel with Stump to Phoenix and Scottsdale, Arizona, where the Indians, Giants, Cubs, and Red Sox were all conducting spring training. In a suite at the Ramada Inn, Stump recalled, Cobb held court. He didn't go to see anybody. Instead, such luminaries as Ford Frick, now baseball's commissioner, American League President Joe Cronin, and Ted Williams, who had just finished his mighty career with the Red Sox, came by at various times to listen to Cobb's preachments about the superiority of the old game and the old ball players. Cobb and Stump left Scottsdale early in April, Cobb clutching the brown paper bag in which, for years now, he had carried around more than $1 million worth of negotiable securities. Starting to fail fast, he stayed at Stump's Santa Barbara beach house. There, 2 physicians examined him and found that the cancer had moved up his back and into his skull. Refusing strong medications, Cobb wondered aloud whether Max Fleischmann, heir to the Fleischmann's yeast fortune and once his friend, hadn't done the right thing in committing suicide instead of suffering hopelessly with cancer. "Where's anybody who cares about me?" he burst out on another occasion. "Where are they? The world's lousy. No good." On April 27th, Cobb somehow gathered his strength to make it to Wrigley Field in Los Angeles for the home opener of the new Los Angeles Angels, one of 2 expansion teams added to the American League over the winter. He thereby kept a promise he had made during spring training in Arizona to Fred Haney, his old utility infielder and now general manager of the Angels. "I told you I'd make it," he greeted Haney. After throwing out the first ball and sitting through 2 innings of the Angels-Minnesota Twins game, he left, leaning on his cane and on a park attendant's arm. He had seen his last baseball game. Confident that he finally had plenty of material to put together Cobb's autobiography, Stump drove Cobb back up to his Atherton place, which still had no electricity, and said goodbye. One of the last to see Cobb at the house where he had entertained so many people over the past 30 years was the aging movie comedian Joe E. Brown. A longtime acquaintance, Brown spent the better part of a week with Cobb, and was surprised to hear him say that if he had his life to do over, he'd do things a little different. Maybe, he mused, he'd been too aggressive. Maybe I went too far. I always had to be right in any argument I was in, and wanted to be first in everything. A day or so later he added, "Joe, I do indeed think I would have done things different. And if I had, I would have had more friends." In mid-May, he flew to Georgia for what he must have known would be his last day in Cornelia. During the 2.5 weeks he was there, Gailey checked on him nearly every day. Sometimes he seemed fairly strong and in reasonably good spirits. At other times, pathetically weak and depressed. Gailey, who had never really known Cobb before he moved to Cornelia in 1957, had come to care deeply about the old man. "I loved him. That's how I felt," was the way Gailey put it later on. It was Gailey who got Cobb to Emory Hospital on June 5th, when he could no longer bear the pain. As always, Cobb had his brown paper sack of securities with him, as well as his Luger. When he occupied his room, He placed the sack on top of the table by his bed and put the Luger on top of that. He then lay back, finally, to accept the injection of drugs that would ease his suffering. For the next month, he drifted in semi-consciousness most of the time. Early in July, his life signs began to fail. Charlie Cobb, accompanied by Jimmy Cobb, Shirley Cobb Beckwith, and Beverly Cobb McLaren, arrived from the West Coast. Whether Cobb recognized any of them during his last days is doubtful. At 1:18 on the afternoon of Monday, July 17, 1961, Cobb died. Physicians officially attributed his death to cancer, complicated by a cardiac condition and diabetes. He had lived just short of 74 years and 7 months. Gailey made the funeral arrangements. The services were held on the 19th in Cornelia at the Christian Church, with the Reverend E.A. Miller, the local minister, and Dr. James R. Richardson of Westminster Presbyterian in Atlanta officiating. His influence will continue to bring the best out of youth, Miller told the 150 or so people in the church. Ty Cobb was never satisfied with second best. Then a hearse carrying his bronze casket led the automobile procession slowly through the red clay hills over the 28 miles to Royston. Uniformed members of local Little League teams lined the way from the Royston Cemetery gate to the Cobb Mausoleum. In all, about 400 people had gathered to watch Cobb's casket borne into the mausoleum and placed above his sister's tomb, and directly across from those of his parents. Besides Charlie Cobb, his 2 daughters, and his 1 surviving son, his 2 sons-in-law and his daughter-in-law had also come, as well as Mary Dunn Cobb and her 3 children. Sid Keener was there representing the Hall of Fame. Ray Schalk and Mickey Cochran had flown down together from Chicago, and Knapp Rucker, Cobb's old Sally League roommate, had driven over from Alpharetta, north of Atlanta. Otherwise, the world of baseball had no visible presence at the funeral of the man who had been possibly its greatest performer, certainly its most fiercely competitive spirit. Epilogue. The final chapter. Cobb had waited until May 22nd to have a will drawn up. Signed and witnessed at Cornelia and filed at Clarksville, the Habersham County seat. It left a quarter of his estate to the Cobb Educational Fund. The remainder, 3/4 of his holdings in stocks and bonds, his 2 houses, and assorted other properties, he bequeathed to his 3 children, and in a trust to his grandchildren, who now numbered 15. Cobb's will relieved the executor, the Trust Company of Georgia, from filing an inventory of the estate, and his family would give out no details. Thus, how much Cobb was actually worth at his death remained something of a mystery. The Sporting News estimated his fortune as being at least $11,780,000. According to what the baseball paper had learned, Cobb had held approximately $10 million in General Motors stock and $1,780,000 in Coca-Cola. Harrison Gailey, however, thought his total worth was about $6 million. Whatever the true figure, Cobb remained the richest man up to that time who had made his name as a professional athlete. 2 months after Cobb's death, Doubleday and Company brought out My Life in Baseball, The True Record, the autobiographical book on which he and Al Stump had worked intermittently for a year. Stump had put Cobb's recollections into book form in a matter of a month or so, and Doubleday had rushed its publication to take advantage of the publicity surrounding Cobb's death. At first, the book sold furiously, Stump reported to Sid Keener. Ultimately, Doubleday recorded sales of 12,000 to 15,000 copies. Quite respectable, though not spectacular. My Life in Baseball remained in print until 1965. It was possibly the best book of its kind ever published. Like most autobiographies, memoirs, and reminiscences, Cobb's account was self-serving and self-justifying. Yet it was also remarkably candid, revealing, and faithful to its subject. The basic Ty Cobb, sensitive, distrustful, courageous, often arrogant, and sometimes mean, came through clearly. The book amounted to a heroic feat of memory, inasmuch as Cobb worked much of the time without notes, clippings, or other referential material. It was not, of course, the true record. Factual mistakes abounded, as did distortions and half-truths. Like John McCallum and numerous others who had written about Cobb, Stump made little effort to check details of Cobb's recollections against contemporary press reports. Yet, as first-hand accounts of sports figures go, my life in baseball would prove exceptionally valuable for understanding a complex man and his time in baseball. Baseball people who read the book failed to question the accuracy of Cobb's memory or interpretation of past events. He did raise a fair number of hackles, though, by his assault on the contemporary game and contemporary players. What he had to say on that score was basically a reprise of his 1952 life pieces and sections of McCallum's 1955 book. Cobb's all-time all-star team, for example, consisted wholly of men who had broken into the majors before 1920, with the exception of Mickey Cochran as one of his catchers, Lefty Grove as one of his pitchers, and Harold Pye Traynor at third base. Even those three had been at the height of their careers when Cobb retired. For all his regard for the heroes of the dead ball era and his regret over what Ruth's slugging ways had done to the game, Cobb had to put the babe in his all-time outfield, along with Tris Speaker and Joe Jackson. George Sisler, Eddie Collins, and Honus Wagner were the rest of his infield. Ray Schalk, his other catcher, Ed Walsh, Walter Johnson, Christy Mathewson, Grover Cleveland Alexander, and Eddie Plank, his pitchers along with Grove. It was a formidable group, so formidable that Cobb was convinced such mid-century stars as Bob Feller, Joe DiMaggio, Stan Musial, Ted Williams, Duke Snyder, Mickey Mantle, and Willie Mays would stand little show with the men of my era. In Cobb's view, baseball had reached a perilous moment in its history. Wild things are happening. The fabric of baseball is crumbling. Other sports, promoted better than baseball, were steadily encroaching on its season and eroding its once dominant place in the American sports scene. Baseball had also undermined itself in various ways. Its recent shifts and additions of franchises had weakened old club loyalties and identities. The virtual abandonment of the waiver system and the introduction of interleague trading had broken down the traditional integrity of the two major leagues. Television and the majors' wild-eyed, desperate expansion had largely destroyed the minor leagues. With their bonuses and big salaries, players lacked the fiery competitiveness of the old-timers. I'd want players less interested in a bonus, a business manager, and a bowling alley than in fighting to win, declared Cobb. But most of all, it was the lively ball and fence swinging that threatened the survival of the game's popularity. Heady play afield and on the bases and scientific hitting had long since gone out the window. Before long, Cobb predicted, the 300-hitter would become extinct. Games were overly long and dull, plagued by ho-hum home runs and a parade of pitchers. The excitement, the unpredictability, the daring and hustle and fight of Cobb's day had largely disappeared. The game had lost its fire and was in danger of losing its place in the hearts of the American sports public. Cobb's Jeremiad, commonly dismissed as the rantings of an old man long out of touch with the realities of a changing sport and business, nevertheless hit the mark in several ways. Franchise hopping, which had started in 1953 and continued through the 1960s, discouraged the kind of fierce attachments to ball clubs that had been one feature of baseball in the old days. The creation of 10 new franchises between 1961 and 1977 spread the talent thinly and brought into being a collection of chronically weak ball clubs, major league in name only. Cobb's prediction about the extinction of 300 hitters almost came true, at least in the American League. In 1968, Carl Yastrzemski at 301 was that circuit's one and only 300 batsman. The National League that year had a total of 5 300-plus regulars. Yet ironically, just when Cobb died, baseball was entering upon still another phase in the evolution of its playing style. With the elimination of racial barriers in the 1940s and 1950s, brilliantly talented American black and Hispanic American players began to make it to the majors. The combination of speed and power so many of them possessed added an exciting new dimension to the game. The very next year after Cobb's death, Maury Wills did what just a few years earlier had seemed absolutely impossible. He broke Cobb's single-season stolen base record and went on to steal an astonishing 104 bases during a 162-game season. In 1965, moreover, Wills stole 94. 5 times he stole at least 50 bases in a major league career that did not begin until he was 26. In 1974, Lou Brock, another black player, stole 118 bases one year, and later smashed Cobb's record for career steals, amassing 938 by the time he retired after the 1979 season. 3 years after that, Rickey Henderson, still another black performer who would have been barred from organized baseball in Cobb's day, reached 130 steals in a single season, and seemed quite capable of averaging a steal a game. An overall renaissance in team base stealing accompanied those stunning individual achievements. While home run hitting, on a per-club basis, tended to level off toward the end of the 50s, the average number of steals per club increased dramatically, from 43 in 1955 to 127 in 1976. If Cobb had lived another decade or so, he would have continued to find much in contemporary baseball to grumble about, and he would have been justified in much of what he had to say. A lack of base stealing, however, would no longer have been a legitimate complaint. For those who revered Cobb's prowess on the diamond, and for his kinspeople who wanted to remember his good qualities and let his faults be entombed with his body, Al Stump's recapitulation of his wild year as Cobb's book collaborator was a most unhappy event. It did not help that the piece was published in True magazine, which aimed at a predominantly male readership, interested less in factual accuracy than in robustly told, often mildly risque tales of adventure and exploit. Yet if overdrawn in places, as it no doubt was, Stump's account had a basic ring of authenticity. The most questionable aspect of what he wrote had to do with his willingness to repeat unverified gossip about events in Cobb's life that took place before Stump knew him. And, of course, the timing of the piece, which appeared only 6 months after Cobb's death, was in dubious taste. In Royston, Georgia, people who had known and liked Cobb and appreciated what he had done for the town had already undertaken a project to commemorate the life of the man they understood to have been basically generous and warm-hearted. Shortly before Cobb died, a group of prominent Royston citizens, led by Stuart Brown, Jr., had started raising money to build a Ty Cobb museum in the town. After Cobb's death, Brown and his associates secured the passage of a bill in the Georgia legislature creating a Ty Cobb Baseball Memorial Commission. Brown was the commission's chairman. Such notables as Governor Carl Sanders, former Governor Ernest Vandiver, Mayor Ivan Allen of Atlanta, George Weiss, now president of the New York Mets, and J.G. Taylor Spink, publisher of the Sporting News, agreed to serve as honorary members of the commission. Each biennium, the legislature was supposed to make an appropriation for the project. Meanwhile, private contributions were supposed to supply more than $500,000. The site chosen for the memorial was 2 acres fronting U.S. Highway 29 on the western outskirts of the town, just down the road from Cobb Memorial Hospital. It was an ambitious scheme, intended not only to memorialize, the greatest and smartest player baseball has ever known, but to attract tourists to the little town as well. It never really worked out. By 1970, the legislature had appropriated $175,000. But Brown now said the commission needed at least $75,000 more from the state. Private contributions had been woefully disappointing. Only about $20,000 had been collected, of which the largest single contribution, $2,500, had come from John E. Fetzer, president of the Detroit Tigers. The commission did have enough to build a structure, a rather handsome one, too. Made of brick, it had 2 wings and an open courtyard with a reflecting pool. A lack of money had forced cancellation of the original plan for a big bronze statue of Cobb to stand in the courtyard area. Apart from insufficient funds, the project's promoters soon discovered that almost no Cobb baseball artifacts were available, inasmuch as nearly all of them had long ago gone to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. There simply was very little to put inside a Cobb shrine at Royston. Another problem was Royston's location, too far off the interstate routes to encourage much tourism. So after 15 years of trying to provide a lasting monument to the most famous person ever to live in Royston, Georgia, Brown and his associates finally had to give up. In the mid-1970s, the commission deeded the building to the town, which made it into a new city hall. The small collection of Cobb memorabilia the commission had put together over the years was moved over to the hospital. A billboard outside town, advertising the shrine, and featuring a reproduction of a famous photograph of Cobb tearing around third, was painted over, producing the strange effect of a blank white rectangle with the silhouette of a baseball player protruding from one corner. Thus, the principal memorial to Ty Cobb would have to be found in the record books and in the first-hand accounts of people who had seen him play. In the 1980s, Cobb's name was again frequently in the baseball news, as Pete Rose continued his steady climb toward Cobb's total career base hits record. Rose, who was a rookie 2 years after Cobb died, was often described as the one contemporary ball player who came closest to playing the game the way Cobb had. Both Rose and Cobb were exceptionally durable, hard-driving men with a passion for winning. There, though, the similarity ended. Cobb was a much faster, more daring, more clever base runner and a far better hitter, according to many people, including Waite Hoyt, who pitched against Cobb and then, for years, as a broadcaster for the Cincinnati Reds, watched Rose in action. "As far as skills are concerned," commented Hoyt, "there is no comparison. Cobb was so brilliant with his bat manipulation that it would be impossible to describe the things he could do." And unlike Cobb, Rose consistently exhibited an affable, even-tempered nature, was able to take criticism, and had no trouble laughing at himself. Cobb's career base hits mark might go the way of his base-stealing records, but his greatness was vastly more than statistics. It was something that only those who saw him in person could really understand, and even they usually had a hard time putting their feelings into words. It was like he was superhuman. Casey Stengel, a National League contemporary, finally summed up his memory of Cobb. A man who set the highest standards for himself and consistently met them, Cobb was never able to understand why most other people failed to share his passion for excellence and refusal to settle for second best. He was never an easy man to know, never easy to get along with, in or out of uniform, never really at peace with himself or the world around him. Ty Cobb was the most volatile, the most fear-inspiring presence ever to appear on a baseball field. His equal is not likely to come along again. This concludes the reading of Ty Cobb by Charles C. Alexander. This book was read by Walter Zimmerman.